In the quiet village of St. Mary Mead, a glamorous stranger's body is found in the grand library of Gossington Hall, shattering the peace. Enter Miss Jane Marple, a sharp-eyed spinster who unravels a web of greed, jealousy, and deadly deception, when a second body, eerily similar to the first, is discovered burned in a quarry. The stakes soar. From the opulent, majestic hotel to a shadowy pier, secrets of a shared past and a fortune at risk lead to a chilling conspiracy. Can Miss Marple trap the killer before the truth is buried forever? Dive into the body in the library where every clue counts. Chapter 1. A Shocking Discovery. The first light of dawn crept over the rolling hills of St. Mary Mead, touching the ivy-clad walls of Gossington Hall with a delicate glow. Inside, the house was still, its corridors hushed save for the faint ticking of the grandfather clock in the hall. Mrs. Dolly Bantry, clad in a sensible dressing gown, descended the broad oak staircase, her thoughts on the day ahead. There was the garden committee to organise, and cook had mentioned something about the butcher's delivery. She pushed open the heavy door to the library, expecting the familiar scent of polished wood and old leather to greet her. Instead she stopped dead, her breath catching in her throat. There, on the hearthrug before the fireplace, lay a young woman. Her platinum blonde hair spilled across the rug like spilled moonlight, and her garish pink evening dress, sequined and clinging, seemed an affront to the room's muted elegance. Her painted nails gleamed under the chandelier's soft light, and her face, frozen in death, bore the heavy makeup of a dance-hall girl. She was utterly, unmistakably out of place. Mrs. Bantry's hand flew to her mouth, stifling a cry. For a moment she stood rooted, her eyes darting over the scene. The library, with its rows of leather-bound volumes, and the portrait of Colonel Bantry's father glowering from above the mantel, had always been a sanctuary. Now it was profaned by this stranger's presence. She backed away, her slippered feet silent on the parquet, and called for her husband. "Arthur! Arthur! Come quickly!" Her voice, usually so composed, cracked with urgency. Colonel Arthur Bantry, retired and fond of his morning routine, was in the dining room, buttering toast with military precision. At his wife's cry, he dropped his knife with a clatter, and strode to the library, his dressing-gown flapping. "What's all this, Dolly?" he demanded, but his words died as he crossed the threshold. The sight of the girl, her garish attire, her lifeless sprawl, drew a sharp intake of breath. "Good God!" he muttered, his ruddy face paling. "Who the devil is she?" "I haven't the faintest idea," Mrs. Bantry replied, her hands twisting together. "She's not one of the maids, nor anyone from the village, I'd wager. That dress, it's not the sort you see in St. Mary Mead." Colonel Bantry approached the body cautiously, as if it might spring to life. He bent down, noting the girl's youth, she could scarcely be more than 18, and the unnatural angle of her neck. "She's dead, Dolly," he said grimly. "Strangled by the look of it." "We must call the police at once." Mrs. Bantry nodded, though her mind was racing. Gossington Hall, their home for decades, was no place for such a horror. The village would talk, and the scandal would cling to them like damp fog. She hurried to the telephone in the hall, her fingers trembling, as she dialed the local constabulary. "Inspector Slack, please," she said when the operator connected her. "It's urgent." Within the hour, the quiet of Gossington Hall was shattered. Inspector Slack, a brisk man with a penchant for efficiency, arrived with a team of constables. The library was cordoned off, and the Bantrys were ushered to the drawing-room, where a young officer took their statements. "We found her just as she is," Mrs. Bantry said, her voice steadier now. "I opened the library door at 7:30, and there she was." The inspector, his notebook open, pressed for details. "No one else was in the house? No guests, no staff who might have seen something?" "Only the servants, Colonel," Bantry said, his moustache twitching with indignation. "And they're all accounted for. The front door was locked as always. I checked it myself last night." Inspector Slack's eyes narrowed, but he said nothing, scribbling furiously. Outside, the village was waking, and already a small crowd had gathered at the gates of Gossington Hall, their whispers carrying on the morning breeze. The news of a body, a young, glamorous stranger, had spread like wildfire. Mrs. Bantry, seated on the drawing-room's chintz sofa, felt a surge of resolve. This was no ordinary crime, and it would take more than Inspector Slack's bluster to unravel it. She turned to her husband. "Arthur, I'm sending for Jane Marple." "Jane Marple?" The Colonel blinked, his brow furrowing. "That old spinster with the knitting. What can she do?" Mrs. Bantry's lips curved in a faint smile. "More than you'd think, Arthur. She has a way of seeing things the rest of us miss." As a maid was dispatched to fetch Miss Marple from her cottage on the high street, Mrs. Bantry gazed out the window, her mind on the dead girl in the library. Who was she, and why had she been left here in their home? The answer, she sensed, lay not in the facts alone, but in the shadows of human nature, shadows that Jane Marple, with her quiet wisdom, was uniquely equipped to illuminate. Chapter 2. The Arrival of Miss Marple. The sun had climbed higher over St. Mary Mead, its rays glinting off the dew-soaked lawns of Gossington Hall. Inside, the atmosphere was taut, the air thick with the murmur of police constables and the occasional, sharp command from Inspector Slack. The library remained sealed, its door guarded by a young officer who stood ramrod straight, as if the weight of the morning's discovery rested on his shoulders. In the drawing-room, Mrs. Dolly Bantry paced, her earlier shock giving way to a restless determination. Colonel Bantry, meanwhile, had retreated to his study, muttering about the indignity of it all. A soft knock at the front door broke the tension. The maid, flustered but efficient, ushered in Miss Jane Marple, who stepped into the hall with the unhurried grace of one accustomed to life's disruptions. Her black lace cap sat slightly askew, and her knitting bag dangled from one arm, a incongruous accessory against the backdrop of tragedy. Her eyes, bright and bird-like, took in the scene with a quiet intensity that belied her frail appearance. "Oh, Dolly, my dear," Miss Marple said, clasping Mrs. Bantry's hands. "What a dreadful business! To find such a thing in one's own home, it's quite unthinkable." Her voice was gentle, but there was a steel beneath it, a hint of curiosity that sharpened her words. Mrs. Bantry led her friend to the drawing-room, where a tray of tea, hastily prepared, sat untouched. "Jane, I'm at my wits' end," she confessed, sinking onto the sofa. "The police are poking about, and Arthur's beside himself. That girl, whoever she is, doesn't belong here. It's as if she was dropped from the sky." Miss Marple settled into an armchair, her knitting bag at her side. She drew out a half-finished scarf, her needles clicking softly as she listened. "Tell me everything, Dolly," she said, "from the moment you opened the library door." Bantry recounted the morning's horror, the garish pink dress, the platinum hair, the lifeless sprawl on the hearthrug. She described Inspector Slack's arrival and his brusque efficiency, as well as the preliminary identification of the girl as Ruby Keene, a dance hostess from the Majestic Hotel in Danemouth. "They say she was strangled," Mrs. Bantry added, her voice low, "and moved to our library after. But why, Jane? Why here?" Miss Marple's needles paused, her eyes narrowing. "A most curious choice," she murmured. "The library is a private space, yet this act feels almost theatrical, as if meant to be seen. We must consider what message was intended, and for whom." She resumed her knitting, the rhythmic click a counterpoint to her racing thoughts. Inspector Slack, summoned by Mrs. Bantry, joined them in the drawing-room. He was a man of action, ill at ease with the elderly spinster's calm scrutiny. "Miss Marple," he said with a curt nod, "Mrs. Bantry says you've a knack for these things. I'll tell you what we know, but it's a straightforward case. Ruby Keene was last seen at the Majestic last night, dancing with the guests. Sometime after midnight she was killed, and her body was brought here. We're questioning the staff and checking alibis." Miss Marple tilted her head, her expression mild. "And what sort of girl was Ruby Keene, Inspector? I find that character often illuminates motive." Slack frowned, flipping open his notebook. According to the hotel manager, she was a lively sort, pretty, ambitious, always chatting up the wealthy patrons. She had admirers naturally. One's a local troublemaker, Basil Blake, lives in that modern bungalow down the lane. Another's a guest at the Majestic, Mark Gaskell, some sort of charming drifter. We'll be speaking to both." "Admirers," Miss Marple echoed, her tone thoughtful. "And where there are admirers, there are often rivals or enemies." She set her knitting aside and leaned forward. "Tell me, Inspector, was anything found with the body? A handbag, perhaps, or a piece of jewellery?" Slack shook his head. "Nothing. Just the dress she was wearing. Cheap, flashy thing. Not what you'd expect in a place like this. No handbag, no papers. It's as if someone wanted her stripped of identity, or to create a particular impression," Miss Marple said softly. She turned to Mrs. Bantry. "Dolly, have you noticed anything unusual in the village lately? Visitors, perhaps, or gossip about the hotel?" Mrs. Bantry frowned, considering. "Well, there's been talk about Basil Blake's parties, wild affairs, with girls from Danemouth, and goodness knows who else. And the Majestic's been busier than usual, with that rich old man Conway Jefferson staying there. People say he's taken a shine to one of the dancers, though I hadn't heard her name until today." Miss Marple's eyes gleamed. "Conway Jefferson," she said, "a name worth noting. Wealth attracts attention, and attention breeds complications." She rose, smoothing her skirt. "I should like to see the library, Inspector, if I may. Sometimes the scene itself speaks." Slack hesitated, clearly sceptical, but Mrs. Bantry's firm nod brooked no argument. He led them to the library, where the young constable stepped aside. The room was as Mrs. Bantry had described, its sombre dignity marred by the chalk outline where Ruby Keene's body had lain. The hearthrug, now removed for evidence, left a bare patch on the floor, and the fireplace stood cold, its ashes undisturbed. Miss Marple moved slowly, her gaze sweeping over the shelves, the heavy drapes, the polished desk. She paused by the window, noting the latch was secure. "No sign of forced entry," she observed. "The body was brought through the house, then. A bold move under the noses of the household." "Exactly," Slack said, seizing the point. "Which is why we're looking at the staff. Someone must have let the killer in." "Or someone with access," Miss Marple countered, her voice soft but firm. She knelt by the chalk outline, her fingers brushing the floor. "This rug was thick, wasn't it, Dolly? It would have muffled any sound. A careful choice, perhaps." Mrs. Bantry shivered. "Jane, you make it sound so calculated." "Murder often is," Miss Marple replied, standing. She turned to Slack. "I shall visit the Majestic Hotel, Inspector, if you've no objection. Ruby Keane's world was there, and I suspect the key to her death lies among those who knew her best." Slack grunted, clearly unconvinced but unwilling to argue. As Miss Marple and Mrs. Bantry returned to the drawing-room, the older woman took her friend's arm. "Jane, do you really think you can solve this? It's so sordid." Miss Marple smiled, a flicker of resolve in her eyes. "Sordid, perhaps, but human, Dolly. And human nature, however dark, follows patterns. We shall find the truth in time." With that, she picked up her knitting, her needles resuming their steady rhythm, as if the chaos of murder were merely another stitch in the tapestry of St. Mary Mead. Chapter 3. The World of Ruby Keane. The Majestic Hotel in Danemouth stood like a grand dame overlooking the sea, its white facade gleaming under the midday sun. Its sprawling terraces and manicured gardens buzzed with the chatter of well-heeled guests, their laughter mingling with the clink of teacups and the distant crash of waves. Yet, beneath this polished veneer, an undercurrent of unease rippled through the staff and patrons alike. The news of Ruby Keane's death had reached the hotel before Miss Jane Marple's modest taxi pulled up to its entrance, and the whispers followed her as she stepped into the marble-floored lobby. Miss Marple, her black lace cap neatly adjusted and her knitting bag tucked under one arm, presented an unassuming figure amid the hotel's opulence. Her mild eyes, however, missed nothing. The nervous glance of the porter, the hushed conversation between two waiters, the way the manager, Mr. Prescott, hurried forward with a smile that was just a shade too bright. "Miss Marple, is it?" he said, extending a hand. "Mrs. Bantry telephoned to say you'd be coming. Such a terrible tragedy about poor Ruby. We're all quite shaken." "I'm sure you are," Miss Marple replied, her tone gentle but probing. "I should like to learn more about Miss Keane, if you'd be so kind. She was employed here, I understand." Mr. Prescott nodded, guiding her to a quiet corner of the lounge, where a velvet-upholstered sofa offered a view of the sea. "Ruby was one of our dance hostesses," he explained, settling opposite her. "A lovely girl, full of life. She joined us about 6 months ago, and she was a favourite with the guests, especially the gentlemen." His voice held a note of professional regret, but his eyes darted toward the lobby, as if expecting interruption. Miss Marple's needles emerged from her bag, clicking softly as she began a new row. "And what sort of girl was she, Mr. Prescott? Ambitious, perhaps? Or content with her lot?" The manager hesitated, choosing his words. "Ambitious, I'd say. Ruby had a way of charming people, making them feel special. She was clever too, knew how to keep the older guests entertained without stepping over the line. But she wasn't one to stay a dance hostess forever. She talked about London, the stage, that sort of thing. Miss Marple nodded, her expression serene. Dreams of a brighter future. And did she have friends here? Or perhaps rivals? Mr. Prescott's smile tightened. Friends, certainly. She was close to Josie Turner, our dance instructor, and her cousin. As for rivals, well, a girl like Ruby attracted attention, and not everyone likes that. Some of the other girls thought she was too forward, but nothing serious, I assure you. The assurance rang hollow, and Miss Marple's eyes sharpened. I see. And were there any particular gentlemen who took an interest in her? I believe Inspector Slack mentioned a Mr. Basil Blake and a Mr. Mark Gaskell. The manager's discomfort was palpable now. He adjusted his tie, glancing toward a group of guests entering the lounge. Basil Blake, yes. He's a young filmmaker, lives near St. Mary Mead. He'd come to the hotel now and then, always with a crowd. Ruby danced with him often. Lively they were, laughing and carrying on. As for Mark Gaskell, he's a guest here, been with us a few weeks. Charming man, bit of a gambler, I hear. He and Ruby seemed friendly, but I wouldn't say more than that. Miss Marple's needles paused, and she looked up, her gaze steady. Friendly, you say? But friendliness can mean many things, Mr. Prescott. I should like to speak with Miss Turner, if she's available, and perhaps see Ruby's room, if it hasn't been disturbed. Mr. Prescott rose, eager to comply. Of course, Josie's in the ballroom, preparing for tonight's dance. I'll take you to her, and then we can arrange for the room. The ballroom was a cavernous space, its chandeliers sparkling even in daylight. Josie Turner stood at its centre, directing a pair of young dancers with crisp efficiency. She was a woman in her early 30s, with sharp features and dark hair, pulled into a tight bun. Her movements were precise, almost mechanical, but her eyes, when they met Miss Marple's, betrayed a flicker of strain. Miss Turner, Mr. Prescott said, this is Miss Marple, a friend of Mrs. Bantrys. She's here about Ruby. Josie's lips pressed into a thin line. I've already spoken to the police, she said, her voice clipped. But if you've questions, I'll do my best. Miss Marple smiled, her manner disarming. Thank you, my dear. I'm sure this is a difficult time. Could you tell me about Ruby? What was she like as a cousin and a colleague? Josie hesitated, then gestured for the dancers to take a break. She led Miss Marple to a corner of the ballroom, where a small table held a stack of sheet music. Ruby was bright, she said at last, always smiling, always talking about what she'd do one day. Films, the West End. She was younger than me, only 18, but she had big ideas. We were close, growing up, though I hadn't seen her much until she came to work here. And how did she fare here, Miss Marple asked, her needles clicking again. The hotel is quite a different world from St. Mary Mead. Josie's gaze drifted to the polished floor. She took to it like she was born for it. The guests loved her, especially the older ones. She'd sit with them, listen to their stories, make them laugh. But it wasn't all rosy. Some of the other girls, Flo for instance, another hostess, they thought Ruby was too eager, always hogging the best partners. Miss Marple nodded, filing the name away. And what of her admirers? I understand she was friendly with Mr. Blake and Mr. Gaskell. Josie's expression hardened. Basil Blake was a lout, if you ask me. He'd show up with his film crowd, all noise and champagne, and Ruby would dance with him, twirling about like she was in one of his pictures. I told her to be careful. He's not the steady sort. As for Mark Gaskell—" She paused, her fingers tightening on the table's edge. "He's married to me, Miss Marple. We've been together 3 years. Ruby was fond of him, but it was just her way. She didn't mean anything by it." The revelation caught Miss Marple off guard, though her face remained composed. "Married," she said softly. "That must have made things delicate with Ruby, being so charming." Josie's eyes flashed. "If you're suggesting anything improper, you're wrong. Mark's a flirt, always has been, but he's my husband. Ruby was family. She wouldn't cross that line, and neither would he." Miss Marple inclined her head, her tone soothing. "Of course, my dear. I only wish to understand Ruby's world. Did she ever mention anyone else? A friend, perhaps, or someone who troubled her?" Josie shook her head, but her hesitation was telling. "No one specific. She'd get letters sometimes from old school friends or the like. I didn't pry. Ruby was private about some things, even with me." Miss Marple thanked her and allowed Mr. Prescott to lead her to Ruby's room, a small but tidy space on the staff quarters' top floor. The room was sparsely furnished: a narrow bed, a wardrobe, a dressing table with a cracked mirror. The police had searched it, but nothing appeared disturbed. Miss Marple's gaze lingered on the dressing table, where a few inexpensive cosmetics and a single hairpin lay scattered. A small photograph, tucked into the mirror's frame, caught her eye. It showed Ruby laughing, her arm around another girl whose face was obscured by a scorch mark. "How curious," Miss Marple murmured, lifting the photograph. "This damage looks deliberate." Mr. Prescott peered over her shoulder. "I hadn't noticed that. The police took some of her things, letters, a diary, but they didn't mention a photo." Miss Marple slipped the photograph into her bag, resolving to show it to Inspector Slack. She opened the wardrobe, finding a few dresses, none as flashy as the one Ruby had worn in death. A pair of worn dancing shoes sat at the bottom, their soles scuffed from countless nights on the ballroom floor. "A simple life," Miss Marple said, "but one with aspirations." As they descended to the lobby, Miss Marple's thoughts turned to the hotel's other guests. Mr. Prescott mentioned Conway Jefferson, the wealthy invalid who had taken a paternal interest in Ruby. "He's a regular here," the manager said. "Lost his wife and children years ago in an accident. Ruby used to sit with him, read to him. He was quite fond of her." Miss Marple's interest quickened. "And his family? Does he have heirs?" "Only a son-in-law, Mark Gaskell, and a daughter-in-law, Adelaide Jefferson," Mr. Prescott replied. "They're both here, though they keep to themselves. Mr. Jefferson's fortune is considerable, and there's been talk he might alter his will." The implications were clear, and Miss Marple's mind began to weave a pattern. Wealth, affection, ambition, these were threads that often tangled into motive. She thanked Mr. Prescott and stepped onto the terrace, where the sea air was sharp and bracing. A young woman, introduced as Adelaide Jefferson, sat alone at a table, her delicate features shadowed by a wide-brimmed hat. She looked up as Miss Marple approached, her eyes wary. "Mrs. Jefferson?" Miss Marple said, her smile warm. "I'm Jane Marple, a friend of the Bantrys. I'm so sorry about Miss Keene. I understand she was dear to your father-in-law." Adelaide's Expression softened, though her hands remained clasped tightly. Yes, Ruby was kind to him. Conway's been lonely since his family passed, and she brought a bit of light into his days. He talked of helping her, perhaps funding her dreams of the stage. I didn't mind. She seemed genuine. "And your husband, Mr. Gaskell?" Miss Marple asked, her tone light. "Did he share that view?" Adelaide's lips twitched, a fleeting sign of unease. "Mark's more practical. He thought Ruby was a bit of a dreamer, but he didn't dislike her. He's been under strain lately. Business matters, you know." Miss Marple nodded, sensing the weight behind the words. She excused herself and made her way to the hotel's bar, where she found Basil Blake lounging with a glass of whisky. It was a handsome young man, with dishevelled hair and a careless charm that bordered on arrogance. His eyes, when they met hers, were bloodshot but alert. "Miss Marple, eh?" he said, grinning. "Heard you're sniffing about Ruby's death. Well, I'll save you the trouble. I knew her, sure, danced with her, had a laugh, but I didn't kill her. Last I saw her was at the hotel, night before last, spinning around the ballroom like she owned it." Miss Marple's gaze was steady. "And where were you after midnight, Mr. Blake? The police are curious, and so am I." His grin faltered. "At my place, throwing a party. Ask anyone. There were dozens of us drinking and dancing till dawn. Ruby was supposed to come, but she never showed." Miss Marple noted the flicker of unease in his voice, the way his fingers tightened on the glass. "Thank you, Mr. Blake," she said, rising. "You've been most helpful." As she left the bar, her mind churned with impressions. Ruby Keene had been a spark in a world of wealth and restraint, her brightness drawing both admiration and resentment. Josie's protectiveness, Mark's charm, Basil's bravado, Conway's affection, each was a piece of a puzzle that had ended in a library in St. Mary Mead. The scorched photograph, in particular, nagged at her. It suggested a secret, one Ruby had kept even from her cousin. Miss Marple returned to her taxi, her knitting bag heavier with the weight of the photograph. As the car wound back towards St. Mary Mead, she gazed at the passing countryside, her thoughts as intricate as the stitches in her scarf. Ruby Keene, she murmured, was more than a dance hostess. She was a catalyst, and someone feared what she might ignite. The truth, she knew, lay not in the glitter of the majestic, but in the shadows it cast. Shadows she would trace, step by careful step, until the pattern was complete. Chapter 4. A Question of Motive. The afternoon light filtered through the tall windows of Gossington Hall, casting long shadows across the drawing-room where Miss Jane Marple sat with Mrs. Dolly Bantry. The house, though still under the scrutiny of Inspector Slack's men, had settled into an uneasy quiet, the initial shock of Ruby Keene's body in the library giving way to a pervasive sense of intrusion. The hearthrug, now removed for forensic examination, left a stark patch on the library floor, a silent reminder of the crime. Miss Marple, her knitting bag at her side, worked steadily on her scarf, the soft click of her needles a counterpoint to the tension in the air. Mrs. Bantry, perched on the edge of a chintz-covered armchair, was restless. "Jane, it's maddening," she said, her hands twisting a lace handkerchief. "The police are tramping through the house. Arthur's snapping at everyone, and the village is positively alive with gossip. They're saying Ruby was some sort of adventuress, dumped here to ruin us. And yet We've no idea why. Miss Marple's eyes, bright and discerning behind her spectacles, met her friend's. Gossip is often a distortion, Dolly, but it carries kernels of truth. Ruby Keane's presence in your library was no accident. It was a calculated act, meant to provoke or mislead. We must discern the motive, and that requires understanding the players in this drama. Mrs. Bantry sighed, leaning back. You've been to the Majestic, Jane. What did you find? Was Ruby the sort of girl to inspire such a thing? Miss Marple set her knitting aside, folding her hands in her lap. Ruby was a spark, Dolly, a girl of ambition and charm, who lit up the staid world of the Majestic Hotel. She was loved by some, envied by others, and perhaps feared by one. Her connections, Josie Turner, Mark Gaskell, Basil Blake, Conway Jefferson, form a web, and at its centre is a question. Why was her body brought here, to Gossington Hall, after her death? The question hung in the air as a maid entered bearing a tray of tea. Mrs. Bantry poured, her hands steadier with the familiar task, and passed a cup to Miss Marple. Inspector Slack says she was strangled elsewhere, likely at the hotel, and moved here in the early hours. But how? The doors were locked, the windows secure. It makes no sense. Miss Marple sipped her tea, her expression thoughtful. It makes sense if we consider the killer's intent. To place a body in a private library requires access and audacity. It suggests either an intimate knowledge of this house or a desire to implicate its occupants. Tell me, Dolly, have you or Arthur had any recent visitors? Tradesmen, perhaps, or guests who might have lingered? Mrs. Bantry frowned, considering. No one out of the ordinary. The usual deliveries, milk, groceries, the post. We had a garden party last week, but that was all neighbours, no strangers. Arthur's been grumbling about the new gardener, but he's a local lad, hardly the murdering type. Miss Marple nodded, filing the information away. And the staff? Any changes, any odd behaviour? The maids are the same, Mary and Ellen, both with us for years. Cook's been testy, but that's because the police keep interrupting her. Kitchen. No, Jane, I can't think of anyone here who'd do such a thing. It's why Arthur's so cross. He feels accused in his own home. The mention of Colonel Bantry prompted Miss Marple to rise. I should like to speak with Arthur, if he's not too busy. His perspective may shed light on the house's routines. Mrs. Bantry led her to the study, where Colonel Bantry sat, at his desk, surrounded by fishing rods and military memoirs. His moustache bristled as he looked up, his face a mixture of irritation and exhaustion. Jane Marple, he said, standing, Dolly says you're poking into this mess. I hope you're better at it than that fool Slack. He's practically accused me of dragging the girl here myself. Miss Marple's smile was disarming. I'm sure the inspector means well, Colonel, but I'd value your thoughts. You locked the house last night, I believe. Always do, he said, puffing out his chest. Checked every door and window, at 10 o'clock as usual. No one could have got in without a key, and I keep those in my desk. The idea of someone sneaking in with a body, it's preposterous. And yet it happened, Miss Marple said gently, which suggests either a key we don't know about, or an oversight. Were you disturbed at all during the night? Any noises, perhaps? The Colonel hesitated, his brow furrowing. Can't say I was. Slept like a log, though Dolly says she heard the dog barking around 3. Thought it was a fox, most likely. We've had trouble with them lately. Miss Marple's interest quickened. "The dog, you say? Where does he sleep?" "Kitchen, near the back door. Old Rover's getting on, but he's still got a good bark." Miss Marple thanked him and returned to the drawing-room, her mind turning over the new detail. A barking dog at 3 in the morning could mean nothing, or everything. She resolved to inspect the back door later. But first, she needed more information about Ruby's world. Mrs. Bantry, sensing her friend's focus, pressed her. "What now, Jane? You've that look, the one you get when you're unraveling something." Miss Marple smiled faintly. "I'm merely collecting threads, Dolly. I'd like to visit Basil Blake's cottage this afternoon. His name keeps surfacing, and his proximity to St. Mary Mead makes him a person of interest. Would you care to come?" Mrs. Bantry, eager for action, agreed, and soon the two women were in a taxi, winding through the village's narrow lanes. Basil Blake's bungalow, a modernist eyesore amid the thatched cottages, stood at the edge of St. Mary Mead, its flat roof and glass walls a source of local scandal. As they approached, the sound of jazz drifted from an open window, and a young woman in a bright scarf lounged on the porch, smoking a cigarette. Miss Marple stepped out, her demeanor unruffled. "Good afternoon," she said to the woman, who looked up with a lazy smile. "Is Mr. Blake at home?" The woman exhaled a plume of smoke. "He's inside, nursing a headache. Who are you, then? More coppers?" "Not at all," Miss Marple said, her tone mild. "I'm Jane Marple, a friend of the Bantrys. I'd like a word about Ruby Keene." The woman's smile faded, and she called over her shoulder, "Basil, visitors!" She rose and sauntered inside, leaving the door ajar. Basil Blake emerged. Moments later, his shirt rumpled and his eyes bleary. He was younger than Miss Marple had expected, perhaps 25, with a boyish charm marred by a sullen edge. "What's this about Ruby?" he asked, leaning against the doorframe. "I told the police everything. I didn't kill her." Miss Marple's gaze was steady. "I'm sure you did, Mr. Blake, but I'd like to hear it myself. You knew Ruby well, I understand." He shrugged, lighting a cigarette. "Well enough. She was a good-time girl, liked to laugh. We danced at the Majestic, had a few drinks. She came to my parties sometimes, livened things up, but that's it. I wasn't her keeper." "And when did you last see her?" Miss Marple asked, her needles clicking as she resumed her knitting on the porch step. "Night before last at the hotel. She was dancing, flirting with the old codgers as usual. Said she might come to my place later, but she didn't. Next thing I know, she's dead in the Bantrys library." His tone was casual, but his fingers trembled slightly as he flicked ash. Mrs. Bantry, unable to stay silent, interjected, "And you expect us to believe you had nothing to do with it? Your parties are the talk of the village. Girls like Ruby, drinking till all hours." Basil's eyes narrowed. "Think what you like, Mrs. Bantry. I throw parties, not murders. Besides, I was here all night with a dozen witnesses. Ask Lola there." He jerked his thumb toward the woman in the scarf, who had reappeared with a glass of gin. Miss Marple turned to Lola, her smile polite. "And you were here, miss?" "Lola Vance," the woman said, her voice husky. "Yeah, I was here. Party went till 4, maybe 5. Basil never left." Miss Marple nodded, though. Her expression gave nothing away. "Thank you both. One last thing, Mr. Blake. Did Ruby ever mention anyone who troubled her? A guest at the hotel, perhaps, or a letter that worried her? Basil frowned, as if the question caught him off guard. Not really. She got letters sometimes, fan mail, she called it. Said some old gent at the hotel was sweet on her, wanted to set her up in London. Thought it was a lark. Miss Marple's interest sharpened, but she kept her tone light. An old gentleman, you say. Did she name him? Nah, just laughed about it. Ruby was like that, always playing the game. He stubbed out his cigarette, his unease palpable. Miss Marple thanked them and returned to the taxi, Mrs. Bantry trailing behind. "What do you make of him, Jane?" she asked as they drove back to Gossington Hall. "He's shifty, if you ask me." "He's hiding something," Miss Marple said, her eyes on the passing hedgerows. "But whether it's guilt or merely embarrassment, I can't yet say. His alibi is convenient, but alibis can be arranged. We must learn more about this old gentleman Ruby mentioned." Back at Gossington Hall, Miss Marple requested a meeting with Inspector Slack, who arrived with a sheaf of reports. His brusqueness had softened slightly, perhaps due to Mrs. Bantry's insistence on Miss Marple's insight. "We've got the autopsy results," he said, spreading papers on the dining table. Ruby Keene was strangled with a scarf or cord, sometime between midnight and 2 a.m. No signs of a struggle, which suggests she knew her killer or was taken by surprise. The body was moved to the library between 3 and 5 based on lividity. Miss Marple studied the report, her mind turning over the timeline. "And the back door, Inspector? Colonel Bantry mentioned the dog barking around 3. Have you examined it?" Slack nodded, though he looked sceptical. "No signs of tampering. Locked tight, key in the Colonel's desk. If someone came through, they had help from inside." "Or a duplicate key," Miss Marple said softly. "Tell me, have you learned anything more about Ruby's connections at the hotel? Mr. Conway Jefferson, for instance?" Slack's eyebrows rose. "The invalid? He's a big fish, pots of money, no direct heirs. Ruby was his favourite, sat with him every evening. Word is, he was planning to adopt her, leave her a chunk of his fortune. That's got his son-in-law, Mark Gaskell, and his daughter-in-law, Adelaide, in a tizzy." Miss Marple's eyes gleamed. "A fortune is a powerful motive, Inspector, and Mark Gaskell is married to Josie Turner, Ruby's cousin. A delicate situation, wouldn't you say?" Slack grunted, scribbling a note. "Delicate's one word for it. Gaskell's got debts, from what I hear, and Josie's no saint, runs that dance business like a drill sergeant. We're checking their alibis, but they're watertight so far." Miss Marple handed him the scorched photograph from Ruby's room. This was in her mirror. The damage suggests someone wanted to hide the other girl's identity. It may be nothing, but I'd suggest showing it to Josie. She might recognize the face. Slack took the photograph, his scepticism tempered by curiosity. "I'll look into it. Anything else, Miss Marple?" "Only a request," she said, rising. "I'd like to see the library again, with your permission. The choice of that room intrigues me." Slack agreed, and they walked to the library, where the chalk outline remained, a ghostly echo of Ruby's form. Miss Marple moved slowly, her gaze sweeping the high ceiling, the heavy drapes, the rows of books. She paused by the fireplace, noting the absence of ash or disturbance. "A clean crime," she murmured. "No struggle, no mess. The killer was methodical, yet bold enough to carry a body through a sleeping house. She turned to the window, checking the latch. Secure, as the Colonel said, and yet the dog barked. I wonder, Inspector, if you've considered the possibility of a distraction, something to draw attention elsewhere while the body was placed. Slack frowned, but he made a note. You think someone staged it, like a play? Life is often a stage, Inspector, Miss Marple said, her smile enigmatic, and this crime feels like a performance, with Gossington Hall as its unlikely theatre. As they left the library, Miss Marple's thoughts were a tapestry of clues. The barking dog, the scorched photograph, Basil's unease, Conway's fortune, each was a thread, and she sensed they were weaving toward a truth far darker than the village suspected. She returned to the drawing-room, where Mrs. Bantry waited, her eyes eager. "Well, Jane," she asked, "have you cracked it?" "Not yet, Dolly," Miss Marple said, resuming her knitting. "But we are closer. Motive is the key, and I suspect it lies in the interplay of love, greed, and fear. Ruby Keene was a catalyst, and someone sought to extinguish her light." As the afternoon waned, Miss Marple gazed out the window, her mind as sharp as the needles in her hands. The truth, she knew, was near, waiting in the shadows of St. Mary Mead's quiet lanes. Chapter 5. The Shadow of Wealth. The late afternoon sun bathed the majestic hotel in a golden haze, its rays glinting off the polished brass of the revolving doors and casting intricate patterns on the terrace flagstones. Inside, the air was thick, with the scent of roses and the murmur of guests, their voices a soft hum beneath the clink of silver spoons against porcelain. Yet the glamour of the hotel felt brittle, as if the news of Ruby Keene's murder had cracked its pristine surface. Miss Jane Marple, seated in a wicker chair on the terrace, observed the scene with her usual quiet intensity, her knitting needles moving rhythmically as she pieced together the fragments of the case. Mrs. Dolly Bantry had returned to Gossington Hall, leaving Miss Marple to pursue her inquiries alone. The visit to Basil Blake's cottage had yielded more questions than answers, and the scorched photograph from Ruby's room weighed heavily in her mind. Its damaged face suggested a secret, one that might unlock the motive behind the girl's death. But it was the mention of Conway Jefferson, the wealthy invalid who had taken a paternal interest in Ruby, that drew Miss Marple back to the Majestic. Wealth, she knew, was a magnet for intrigue, and Conway's fortune cast a long shadow over the hotel's glittering world. She had arranged to meet Inspector Slack at the hotel, and he arrived promptly, his notebook in hand, and his expression a mix of impatience and grudging respect. "Miss Marple," he said, settling into a chair opposite her, "I've shown that photograph to Josie Turner, as you suggested. She claims it's just an old picture of Ruby with a school friend. Nothing special. Said she doesn't know why it's scorched." Miss Marple's needles paused, her eyes narrowing slightly. "And did you believe her, Inspector?" Slack shrugged, his jaw tight. "She's a cool one, Josie. Didn't bat an eye, but I got the sense she was holding back. I've sent the photo for analysis. Might be able to salvage something from the damaged bit. Meanwhile, we've been digging into Conway Jefferson. His plan to adopt Ruby was no secret, and it's got his family and estate." Miss Marple nodded, her gaze drifting to a group of guests on the terrace. Among them was Mark Gaskell, his lean frame elegant in a tailored suit, his smile easy as he chatted with an elderly couple. Yet there was a restlessness in his movements, a flicker of tension that belied his charm. "Mr. Gaskell stands to lose a great deal if Conway's fortune is diverted," she said softly. "And his wife, Josie, must feel the strain as well." A delicate position for a cousin. Slack leaned forward, his voice low. "Delicate's putting it mildly. Gaskell's got debts, gambling mostly, from what we've heard. Josie's been keeping the dance business afloat, but it's a struggle. If Conway left his money to Ruby, they'd be out in the cold. Gives them both a reason to want her gone." Miss Marple's expression remained serene, but her mind was racing. "And Adelaide Jefferson. She too has a stake in Conway's wealth." "Adelaide's different," Slack said, flipping through his notes. "Quiet, keeps to herself. She's devoted to Conway, but she's got a son from her first marriage, and he's at school. Conway's been generous, but if Ruby got the lion's share, it'd hit her hard. Still, she doesn't strike me as the murdering type." "Types can be deceptive," Miss Marple murmured, resuming her knitting. "I should like to meet Mr. Jefferson, Inspector. His perspective on Ruby may illuminate her role in this tangled affair." Slack agreed, and they made their way to Conway Jefferson's suite, a spacious set of rooms on the hotel's top floor. The invalid was seated in a cushioned wheelchair by a large window, his view of the sea framed by heavy velvet curtains. He was a man in his late 60s, his face lined with grief and illness, but his eyes were sharp, alive with a stubborn vitality. Beside him stood Adelaide Jefferson, her delicate hands resting on the back of his chair, her expression one of quiet vigilance. "Miss Marple," Conway said, his voice warm but weary as she was introduced. "Inspector Slack says you're helping with this dreadful business. Ruby was a dear girl, a ray of sunshine. I can't fathom why anyone would harm her." Miss Marple took a seat, her knitting bag at her feet. "I'm so sorry for your loss, Mr. Jefferson. I understand Ruby spent much time with you. What was she like in your eyes?" Conway's face softened, a faint smile touching his lips. "She was a delight, full of dreams, but kind, not selfish. She'd sit here for hours, reading to me or telling stories about her life. I lost my family years ago, my wife, my children, and Ruby filled a void. I wanted to help her, give her a chance at the stage or whatever she fancied. I was going to adopt her, make it official." Adelaide's hands tightened briefly on the chair, but her voice was steady when she spoke. "Ruby was good for Conway. She brought him joy, and I was grateful for that. My son, Peter, needs stability, and Conway's support has been a blessing. Ruby's plans didn't change that." Miss Marple noted the measured tone, the careful choice of words. "And how did others react to your intentions, Mr. Jefferson? Your family, for instance?" Conway's smile faded. "Mark was sceptical, thought Ruby was after my money, though I told him she wasn't. He's a practical sort, always worrying about the future. Josie, too, had her doubts, but she was kinder about it. They both knew I'd provide for them, but I suppose the idea of a stranger sharing the estate was unsettling." Miss Marple's gaze shifted to Adelaide, who met her eyes with a calm that seemed almost rehearsed. "And you, Mrs. Jefferson? Did you share their concerns?" Adelaide hesitated, then shook her head. "I trusted Conway's judgment. Ruby was young, perhaps a bit naive, but she seemed genuine. I only wished for his happiness." The conversation turned to Ruby's habits, and Conway described her as a creature of the hotel's nightlife, dancing until the early hours, yet always finding time for him. "She was popular," he said, "but I sensed she was lonely too. She'd talk about her childhood, her cousin Josie, but never about close friends. I think she wanted a family in her way." Miss Marple listened, her needles clicking softly. The picture of Ruby was becoming clearer. A girl of ambition and warmth, caught in a world of wealth and rivalry. As they left the suite, she thanked Conway and Adelaide, her mind turning over the dynamics of the Jefferson family. Mark's debts, Josie's protectiveness, Adelaide's restraint. Each suggested a motive, yet none felt complete. On the terrace, Miss Marple found Mark Gaskell alone, smoking a cigarette and staring at the sea. He turned as she approached, his smile quick but guarded. "Miss Marple, isn't it? I hear you're the village sleuth. Come to grill me about Ruby?" Her smile was disarming. "Hardly, Mr. Gaskell. I'm merely trying to understand Ruby Keene. You knew her well, I believe." Mark exhaled a plume of smoke, his eyes narrowing. "Well enough. She was Josie's cousin, so we saw a lot of her. Bright girl, full of schemes, liked to flirt, but it was harmless. Part of the job, you know. She'd bat her eyes at Conway, get him talking about his glory days. He ate it up." "And you?" Miss Marple asked, her tone light. "Did you find her charming?" He laughed, a sharp sound. "Sure, she was charming. But I'm married, Miss Marple, and Josie's not the type to share. Ruby was fun, nothing more. If you're fishing for scandal, you're barking up the wrong tree." Miss Marple's gaze was steady. "I'm fishing for truth, Mr. Gaskell. Ruby's death was no accident, and her connection to your family is significant. Were you at the hotel the night she died?" Mark's smile faded, his fingers tightening on the cigarette. "I was here, playing cards in the lounge until 1, then bed. Josie can vouch for me. We share a room. Ask the staff, they'll tell you." Miss Marple nodded, though she noted the defensiveness in his tone. "And did Ruby ever mention anything that troubled her? A letter, perhaps, or an unexpected visitor?" He shook his head, but his hesitation was telling. "Not that I recall. She was always laughing, always on the move. If she had troubles, she kept them to herself." Miss Marple thanked him and moved to the ballroom, where Josie Turner was overseeing a rehearsal. The dancers moved with mechanical precision, but Josie's sharp commands betrayed her tension. She spotted Miss Marple and approached, her expression guarded. "Back again, Miss Marple. I've told you all I know about Ruby." "I'm sure you have," Miss Marple said, her voice soothing. "But I wondered about her life outside the hotel. You mentioned she received letters, fan mail perhaps. Did she ever share their contents?" Josie's eyes flickered, but she shook her head. "Not really. Ruby got letters from old friends, sometimes from guests who'd taken a shine to her. She'd laugh them off, say they were silly. I didn't pry. She was entitled to her privacy." Miss Marple held up the scorched photograph, watching Josie closely. "This was in her room. You told the inspector it was a school friend, but the damage is curious. Can you recall anything more about the girl in the picture?" Josie's face remained impassive, but her hands clenched briefly. "Like I said, just a friend. Ruby had a temper sometimes. She might have burned it herself, in a mood. I don't know who the girl was, not really." Miss Marple slipped the photograph back into her bag, unconvinced. "Thank you, Miss Turner. One last thing. How did Ruby seem in the days before her death? Any change in her mood?" Josie hesitated, then shrugged. She was her usual self, busy, cheerful, maybe a bit distracted, but that was normal for her. She was always juggling things. Miss Marple left the ballroom, her thoughts a whirl of impressions. Josie's reticence, Mark's defensiveness, Conway's affection, all pointed to a web of relationships strained by Ruby's presence. The photograph, with its deliberate damage, suggested a hidden connection, one that someone had gone to lengths to obscure. As evening fell, Miss Marple returned to the terrace where the hotel's guests were gathering for dinner. She spotted Flo, the dance hostess who had reportedly resented Ruby, serving drinks with a practised smile. Miss Marple approached, her manner grandmotherly. "Miss Flo, is it? I'm Jane Marple, looking into poor Ruby Keene's death. Might I have a word?" Flo's smile faltered, but she nodded, setting down her tray. "Sure, but I didn't know Ruby that well. She was always the star, you know, got all the attention." Miss Marple's eyes were kind but probing. It must have been difficult working in her shadow. "Did you ever notice anything unusual about her? A visitor, perhaps, or a conversation that struck you?" Flo glanced around, lowering her voice. "Ruby was a climber, always cozying up to the rich ones. I saw her arguing with Basil Blake once, outside the bar. Something about a promise he didn't keep. And there was a girl, a few weeks back, looked a lot like Ruby. They were talking in the lobby, all secretive. I thought it was odd, but Ruby brushed it off when I asked." Miss Marple's interest quickened. "A girl who resembled her? Can you describe her?" Flo frowned, thinking. "Young, blonde, same build. Wore a cheap coat, not like Ruby's fancy dresses. I only saw her once, then she was gone. Ruby said she was a cousin, but not Josie." Miss Marple thanked her, her mind racing. A girl who looked like Ruby, seen weeks before her death, added a new layer to the puzzle. Was this the face in the scorched photograph? And why had Josie denied its significance? As she prepared to leave the hotel, Miss Marple encountered Adelaide Jefferson again, walking alone in the garden. The younger woman's face was drawn, her eyes distant. Miss Marple paused, her voice gentle. "Mrs. Jefferson, you've been most kind to your father-in-law. It can't be easy, with Ruby's death stirring such turmoil." Adelaide's lips trembled, but she steadied herself. "It's been hard, Miss Marple. Conway's heartbroken, and Mark, he's so restless. I just want peace for us all." Miss Marple nodded, sensing the weight of unspoken fears. "Peace comes with truth, my dear. If you think of anything at all that might help, you know where to find me." Adelaide nodded, her eyes glistening, and Miss Marple left her to the gathering dusk. In the taxi back to St. Mary Mead, she gazed at the darkening countryside, her thoughts a tapestry of clues. The shadow of Conway Jefferson's wealth loomed large, its promise and peril entwining Ruby's fate with those around her. The mysterious girl, the scorched photograph, the tensions within the Jefferson family, all were threads in a pattern that was beginning to emerge. Back at her cottage, Miss Marple sat by the fire, her knitting in her lap. "Ruby Keene," she murmured, "was a pawn in a larger game, but whose hand moved her?" The answer, she sensed, lay in the delicate balance of greed and loyalty, a balance she would tip, stitch by careful stitch, until the truth was laid bare. Chapter 6. A Tangled Web. The soft glow of twilight settled over St. Mary Mead, draping the village in a hush that belied the turmoil stirred by Ruby Keane's murder. At Gossington Hall, the weight of the investigation lingered like a persistent fog, with police constables still combing the grounds and Inspector Slack's brusque commands echoing through the corridors. Miss Jane Marple, having returned from her illuminating visit to the Majestic Hotel, sat in the Bantrys' drawing-room, her knitting needles moving with a steady rhythm that contrasted with the restless energy of her thoughts. The scorched photograph, the mysterious girl who resembled Ruby, and the shadow of Conway Jefferson's wealth had woven a complex pattern in her mind, one she was determined to unravel. Mrs. Dolly Bantry, seated across from her, was a study in agitation. Her hands fidgeted with a silver cigarette case, and her eyes darted to the window, where the last rays of sunlight glinted off the lawn. "Jane, you've been awfully quiet since you got back," she said, her voice tinged with impatience. "What did you find at the hotel? Is it true that old Mr. Jefferson was going to leave his fortune to that girl? The village is buzzing with it." Miss Marple's needles paused, and she looked up, her expression serene, but her eyes sharp. "The village always buzzes, Dolly, but we mustn't let rumours cloud our judgment." Mr. Jefferson's affection for Ruby was genuine, and his intention to adopt her was a significant factor in her world. It created tensions, particularly with his son-in-law, Mark Gaskell, and his daughter-in-law, Adelaide. But there is more to this puzzle, something hidden, perhaps in Ruby's past. Mrs. Bantry leaned forward, her curiosity piqued. Her past? You mean that photograph you mentioned with the burned face? Do you think it's connected? "I am certain of it," Miss Marple said, resuming her knitting. The damage was deliberate, suggesting someone wished to conceal the identity of the girl pictured with Ruby. Josie Turner's dismissal of it as a mere school friend was too casual, and Flo, the dance hostess, spoke of a girl who looked like Ruby, seen at the hotel weeks ago. These are not coincidences, Dolly. They are threads in a web, and we must follow them carefully. The drawing-room door opened, admitting Colonel Bantry. His face flushed from an encounter with Inspector Slack. "That man's insufferable," he muttered, sinking into an armchair. "He's been grilling the staff again, as if they'd smuggle a body into our library. Jane, have you made any sense of this madness?" Miss Marple smiled, her tone gentle. "I am beginning to, Colonel, but I need your help. You mentioned the dog barking at 3 a.m. Could you show me the back door where Rover sleeps? I'd like to examine it myself." The Colonel blinked, surprised but compliant. "Of course, if you think it matters. Though Slack's already poked, around there." He led Miss Marple and Mrs. Bantry to the kitchen, where the back door stood sturdy and unyielding, its brass lock gleaming in the lamplight. Rover, an aging spaniel, lay curled in a basket nearby, his ears twitching at their approach. Miss Marple knelt, her fingers brushing the door's frame, noting the faint scratches near the lock. "These marks," she said, "are they new, Colonel?" He squinted, frowning. "Can't say I've noticed them before. Could be from the gardener's tools. He's careless with the wheelbarrow. But the lock's solid and the key was in my desk." Miss Marple rose, her gaze thoughtful. A solid lock can be opened with a duplicate key, or even a skilled hand. The scratches suggest an attempt, successful or not. And Rover's barking indicates something disturbed him. We must consider how the killer gained entry, and why they chose this house. Mrs. Bantry shivered, wrapping her cardigan tighter. It's chilling, Jane. To think someone crept through here with a body while we slept. Chilling but calculated, Miss Marple said. The library was a stage, and Ruby's body the centrepiece. We must return to her world to understand the script. Determined to pursue the lead about the mysterious girl, Miss Marple requested a second visit to the Majestic Hotel the following morning. Mrs. Bantry, eager to escape the oppressive atmosphere of Gossington Hall, insisted on accompanying her. The taxi ride to Danemouth was quiet, with Miss Marple's thoughts fixed on the photograph and Flo's account of the look-alike girl. She sensed a connection, perhaps a secret Ruby had guarded that had led to her death. At the Majestic, the lobby was a flurry of activity, with guests preparing for a charity gala that evening. Mr. Prescott, the manager, greeted them with his usual polished courtesy, though his eyes betrayed a flicker of strain. "Miss Marple, Mrs. Bantry," he said, "I hope you're making progress. The staff are on edge, and the guests are starting to ask questions." "We are doing our best," Miss Marple said, her tone reassuring. "I'd like to speak with Flo again, if she's available, and perhaps revisit Ruby's room. There may be something we overlooked." Mr. Prescott nodded, summoning Flo from the bar. The dance hostess approached, her expression wary but resigned. "Miss Marple," she said, wiping her hands on her apron, "I've told you what I know. Ruby was trouble, always stirring things up." Miss Marple's smile was kind but probing. "I appreciate your candour, Flo. You mentioned a girl who looked like Ruby, seen in the lobby a few weeks ago. Can you recall anything more? Her manner, perhaps, or what she said?" Flo hesitated, glancing at Mr. Prescott, who had stepped away to answer a guest's query. She was nervous, kept looking around like she didn't want to be seen. Ruby called her Dinah once, when they thought I wasn't listening. They were arguing, not loud, but sharp, like Ruby owed her something. I didn't hear much, but Dinah left in a huff, and Ruby was rattled after. Miss Marple's interest sharpened. "Dinah," she repeated softly, "and you're certain she resembled Ruby?" "Spitting image," Flo said, nodding. "Same blonde hair, same figure. Could have been sisters, except Ruby was all glamour, and this girl looked, well, shabby." Miss Marple thanked her and asked Mr. Prescott to lead them to Ruby's room. The small space was as she remembered. The narrow bed, the cracked mirror, the sparse wardrobe. She searched the dressing table again, hoping for a clue the police had missed. Beneath a powder compact, she found a folded scrap of paper, its edges frayed. Unfolding it, she saw a hurried scrawl, "Meet me at the pier, 8 p.m. D." Mrs. Bantry, peering over her shoulder, gasped, "Jane, do you think D is Dinah? Could she be the killer?" "It's possible," Miss Marple said, slipping the note into her bag. "But we mustn't leap to conclusions. This note suggests a meeting, perhaps one Ruby kept, or one that led to her death. We must learn more about this Dinah." Leaving the room, Miss Marple sought out Josie Turner, who was in the ballroom, adjusting a dancer's posture with a critical eye. Josie's face tightened as she saw Miss Marple and Mrs. Bantry approach. "Miss Marple," she said, her voice cool, "you're persistent. I've got a gala to prepare for, so I hope this is quick." "I'll be brief," Miss Marple said, her tone disarming. "I've learned of a girl named Dinah, seen with Ruby a few weeks ago. Flo says they argued, and they looked strikingly similar. Can you tell me anything about her?" Josie's eyes flickered, but she shook her head. "Dinah doesn't ring a bell. Ruby had lots of friends, some from her old life. If this girl looked like her, maybe it was a cousin or something. I wouldn't know." Miss Marple held up the scorched photograph, watching Josie closely. This picture was in Ruby's room. The face of the other girl, possibly Dinah, was burned. You said it was a school friend, but I wonder if you've remembered anything more. Josie's composure faltered, her hands clenching briefly. "I told you, it's nothing. Ruby was careless, probably burned it by accident. I don't know who the girl was, and I don't care. Now, if you'll excuse me, I have work to do, sis." Bantry, indignant at the dismissal, opened her mouth to protest, but Miss Marple touched her arm, signalling silence. As they left the ballroom, Mrs. Bantry whispered, "She's lying, Jane. Did you see her face? She knows something about that Dinah girl." "I believe she does," Miss Marple said, her voice low. "But Josie is protecting someone, or something. We must tread carefully." Their next stop was the hotel's lounge, where Mark Gaskell was playing bridge with a group of guests. His charm was in full force, his laughter ringing out. But Miss Marple noted the tension in his shoulders, the way his eyes darted to the door. She approached, her manner grandmotherly. "Mr. Gaskell, might I interrupt for a moment? I'm Jane Marple, looking into Ruby's death." Mark's smile was quick but strained. "Of course, Miss Marple. Terrible business. What can I do for you?" "I've heard of a girl named Dinah, seen with Ruby recently," Miss Marple said, her gaze steady. "They argued, and she resembled Ruby closely. Did Ruby ever mention her to you?" Mark's fingers paused on his cards, but he recovered swiftly. "Dinah? No, doesn't sound familiar. Ruby was always chatting about this or that friend, but I didn't pay much attention. She was Josie's cousin, you know. Family stuff was their business." Miss Marple nodded, unconvinced. "And the night Ruby died, you were here, playing cards until 1. No chance you saw her after, perhaps leaving the hotel?" Mark's eyes narrowed, but his tone remained light. "Like I told the police, I was here, then bed. Josie was with me. Ruby was dancing when I last saw her, all smiles. Sorry, I can't be more help." Miss Marple thanked him and moved to the terrace, where Adelaide Jefferson sat alone, a book, open but unread, in her lap. Her delicate features were drawn, and her eyes held a quiet sorrow. Miss Marple approached, her voice gentle. "Mrs. Jefferson, I hope I'm not intruding. I wondered if Ruby ever spoke of a girl named Dinah, perhaps a friend or relative." Adelaide looked up, her expression guarded. "Dinah? No, I don't recall. Ruby talked about her childhood sometimes, but it was always vague. Stories about school, nothing specific. She was close to Josie, of course, but no one else stood out." Miss Marple noted the hesitation, the careful phrasing. "And how was Ruby in the days before her death? Did she seem troubled?" Adelaide's fingers tightened on the book. "She was quieter, perhaps. I thought it was the pressure of the hotel, all those eyes on her. Conway noticed it too, but she brushed it off, said she was fine." Miss Marple thanked her and returned to the lobby, where Inspector Slack was waiting with a fresh report. "We've traced Ruby's movements the night she died," he said, his voice clipped. "She danced until midnight, then told a waiter she was stepping out for air. No one saw her after that until her body turned up at Gossington Hall. We're checking the pier, based on that note you found." Miss Marple's eyes gleamed. "The pier is a promising lead, Inspector, and I'd suggest looking into missing persons reports for a girl named Dinah, possibly a runaway, who matches Ruby's description. She may be the key to this web." Slack nodded, scribbling a note. "I'll get on it. Anything else?" "Only a hunch," Miss Marple said, her tone thoughtful. "Ruby's death was planned, but the choice of Gossington Hall feels personal, as if the killer wanted to wound the Bantrys or shield someone else. We must consider all possibilities." As they parted, Miss Marple and Mrs. Bantry returned to the taxi, the weight of the day's discoveries settling over them. The drive back to St. Mary Mead was silent, with Miss Marple's thoughts fixed on the tangled web of relationships. Josie's secrecy, Mark's evasiveness, Adelaide's restraint, and the elusive Dinah, whose shadow loomed larger with each clue. The note, the photograph, the scratches on the back door, all were pieces of a puzzle that pointed to a deeper truth. At Gossington Hall, Miss Marple retired to the guest room, her knitting bag at her side. She sat by the window, gazing at the moonlit garden, her mind as sharp as the needles in her hands. "Ruby Keene," she murmured, "was caught in a web not of her making, but who spun it?" The answer, she sensed, lay in the interplay of loyalty and betrayal, a truth she would uncover, stitch by careful stitch, in the quiet heart of St. Mary Mead. Chapter 7. The Second Body. The dawn broke over St. Mary Mead with a deceptive calm. The village's thatched roofs and winding lanes bathed in a soft, rosy light that belied the grim undercurrent of Ruby Keene's murder. At Gossington Hall, Rutherja Bantrys' home remained a focal point of police activity, with constables moving quietly through the grounds and Inspector Slack's clipped voice issuing orders from the library. Miss Jane Marple, however, was not at the hall. She had risen early, her mind restless with the threads of the case, the scorched photograph, the mysterious Dinah, the note about a meeting at the pier, and had taken a taxi to Danemouth, determined to pursue a hunch that had taken root during the night. The majestic hotel, though still elegant, bore the strain of recent events. Guests whispered over their morning coffee, and the staff moved with a subdued efficiency that spoke of unease. Miss Marple, her black lace cap neatly in place and her knitting bag slung over her arm, stepped into the lobby, her mild eyes scanning the scene. She had arranged to meet Inspector Slack, who had promised an update on the pier investigation and the search for the elusive Dinah. As she waited, her thoughts returned to the delicate web of relationships surrounding Ruby. Josie Turner's guarded responses, Mark Gaskell's calculated charm, Adelaide Jefferson's quiet reserve, and Conway Jefferson's paternal affection. Each was a strand, but the pattern remained incomplete. Inspector Slack arrived, his face grim and his notebook bristling with new pages. "Miss Marple," he said, guiding her to a quiet alcove off the lobby. "We've had a development. A bad one. Another body's been found in a quarry just outside Danemouth. Charred, barely recognizable, but dental records identify her as Dinah Lee, a 16-year-old runaway reported missing 3 weeks ago. She matches the description Flo gave. Blonde, slight, like Ruby. Miss Marple's needles, which had begun their familiar rhythm, paused. Her eyes sharpened, though her voice remained soft. "Dinah Lee," she murmured. "The girl from the photograph, perhaps. This is no coincidence, Inspector. 2 girls, so alike, both dead. What else can you tell me?" Slack flipped open his notebook. His tone clipped. The body was found by a hiker at dawn, burned with petrol, likely to destroy evidence, but the teeth survived. Dinah was last seen in Danemouth, working odd jobs, including a brief stint as a cleaner at the Majestic. She vanished after a row with Ruby, according to a hotel porter who overheard them. The quarry's remote. Someone went to great lengths to hide her. Miss Marple's mind raced, piecing together the implications. And her clothing? Was there anything to suggest a connection to Ruby? Slack nodded, his expression darkening. She was wearing a dress identical to the one Ruby had on in the library. Pink, sequined, cheap. But it was partly burned, and the size was off, like it didn't fit her properly. We're thinking it was deliberate to make us think she was Ruby at first. Miss Marple's gaze drifted to the lobby's chandelier, its crystals catching the morning light. "A deliberate misdirection," she said softly. "Someone wanted Dinah's body mistaken for Ruby's, perhaps to delay the investigation. But Ruby's body was placed in Gossington Hall, a bold and public act. This suggests a plan, a complex one, with layers of deception." Slack leaned forward, his skepticism tempered by curiosity. "You're saying the killer planned 2 murders? Why kill Dinah at all?" "Not necessarily 2 murders planned from the start," Miss Marple said, resuming her knitting. "Dinah may have been an unintended victim, killed because she knew something, or because she was mistaken for Ruby. Her resemblance is the key. We must learn how she crossed Ruby's path and why her death was concealed." Slack scribbled a note, his jaw tight. "I've got men searching the quarry for more evidence, and we're re-interviewing the hotel staff. Josie Turner's on my list. She clammed up about that photograph, and now I'm wondering if she knew Dinah. Any thoughts on where to start, Miss Marple?" Miss Marple's eyes gleamed. "I'd begin with the pier, Inspector. The note I found in Ruby's room suggested a meeting there, possibly with Dinah, and I'd like to speak with Conway Jefferson again. His affection for Ruby may have stirred jealousies we've yet to uncover." Slack agreed, and they parted with the inspector heading to coordinate his team, and Miss Marple making her way to Conway Jefferson's suite. The invalid was alone, his wheelchair positioned by the window, his face etched with a grief that seemed to have deepened overnight. He greeted Miss Marple with a weary nod, his hands trembling slightly as he adjusted a blanket over his knees. "Miss Marple," he said, his voice heavy, "I heard about the second girl. Dinah Lee, they're saying. I never met her, but the police think she's tied to Ruby. How can this be happening?" Miss Marple took a seat, her knitting bag at her feet. "It's a terrible tragedy, Mr. Jefferson. I'm trying to understand Dinah's connection to Ruby. Did Ruby ever mention a girl who looked like her? Perhaps a friend or acquaintance from her past?" Conway frowned, his eyes distant. "Not that I recall. Ruby talked about her childhood, but it was always Josie she mentioned. Her cousin, her anchor. She was vague about others. Once she said something about a girl who'd been kind to her when she was younger, but it was a passing comment, nothing specific." Miss Marple nodded, filing the detail away. And in the days before her death, did Ruby seem anxious? Perhaps about a meeting or a letter? Conway's face clouded. She was quieter, yes. I thought it was the strain of the hotel. All those performances. But one evening she got a telephone call, here, in my suite. She stepped into the hall to take it, and when she came back, she was pale, distracted. Said it was nothing, just a friend, but I didn't believe her. Miss Marple's interest quickened. A telephone call. Did you hear any of it or see who called? He shook his head. No, the switchboard handles all calls. But it was late, around 9, the night before she died. I wish I'd pressed her, but she smiled and changed the subject as she always did. Miss Marple thanked him, her mind turning over the new clue. A telephone call, a meeting at the pier, a scorched photograph. Each pointed to a secret Ruby had kept, one that had drawn Dinah Lee into its orbit. She left the suite and sought out the hotel's switchboard operator, a young woman named Clara, who was stationed in a cramped room off the lobby. Clara, nervous but eager to help, confirmed that Ruby had received a call at 9:05 p.m. 2 nights ago from an outside line. I didn't listen in, Clara said, blushing, but it was a woman's voice, young, sounded urgent. Miss Marple's next stop was the pier, a weathered structure jutting into the sea, its boards creaking under the weight of gulls and the occasional fisherman. Inspector Slack's men were already there, combing the area for evidence, but the tide had washed away much of the night's traces. Miss Marple walked to the pier's end, her gaze sweeping the horizon. The note, "Meet me at the pier, 8 p.m. D," suggested a rendezvous, but whether Ruby had kept it was unclear. The pier's isolation made it an ideal spot for a private meeting or an ambush. Returning to the hotel, Miss Marple found Josie Turner in the ballroom, supervising the final preparations for the gala. Josie's sharp features were drawn, and her eyes held a wariness that deepened as Miss Marple approached. "Miss Marple," she said, her voice clipped, "I heard about the second body. It's awful, but I don't know anything about it. Can't you leave me to my work?" Miss Marple's smile was disarming. "I'll be brief, Miss Turner. The girl was Dinah Lee, a runaway who worked briefly at the hotel. Flo saw her arguing with Ruby, and you told the inspector the scorched photograph was of a school friend. I believe you know more than you've said. Dinah's death is linked to Ruby's, and the truth will come out." Josie's hands clenched, her composure cracking. "I don't know any Dinah Lee. Ruby had her secrets, yes, but I didn't pry. That photograph, it was just some girl. I don't know who. Why are you hounding me?" Miss Marple's gaze was steady. "Because you loved Ruby, Miss Turner, and you're protecting someone, or something. Dinah's resemblance to Ruby suggests a connection perhaps from your shared past. If you know anything, now is the time to speak." Josie's eyes glistened, but she shook her head. "You're wrong. I don't know anything. Leave me alone." She turned away, her shoulders rigid, and Miss Marple let her go, sensing that pressure would yield nothing yet. In the lounge, Miss Marple found Mark Gaskell, his charm subdued as he sipped a whiskey. He looked up as she approached, his smile thin. "Miss Marple, you're everywhere. Heard about the quarry girl? Nasty business." "Indeed," Miss Marple said, settling into a chair. "Dinah Lee, a runaway who looked like Ruby. Did you ever see her at the hotel? Perhaps with Ruby. Mark's fingers tightened on his glass. Never heard of her. Ruby was always with her crowd, dancers, guests, that filmmaker Blake. If this Dinah was around, I didn't notice. Miss Marple noted the evasion, but pressed gently. And the night Ruby died, you were playing cards until 1. Then, with Josie, did you see Ruby leave the hotel, perhaps heading to the pier? Mark's eyes narrowed. I told you, I was here. Ruby was dancing when I last saw her, around 11. After that, I didn't keep tabs. Why the pier? A note suggested a meeting, Miss Marple said, watching him closely. It's possible. Ruby went there and met her killer. Mark shrugged, but his unease was palpable. Possible, but I wouldn't know. Sorry, Miss Marple, I've got a game to get back to. Miss Marple thanked him and sought out Adelaide Jefferson, who was in the garden tending a bed of roses. Her delicate hands moved with care, but her face was pale. Her eyes shadowed. Mrs. Jefferson, Miss Marple said, approaching. I'm sorry to trouble you again. Have you heard of Dinah Lee, the girl found in the quarry? Adelaide's. Hands stilled, her expression tightening. Yes, the police mentioned her. It's horrific. I never met her, but they say she looked like Ruby. I can't imagine what it means. Miss Marple's tone was gentle. It means someone wanted to confuse or conceal. Did Ruby ever speak of a girl from her past? Perhaps someone who shared her dreams? Adelaide shook her head, her voice soft. No, she was private about her past. She'd talk about the future, London, the stage, but not about old friends. I wish I could help. Miss Marple thanked her, sensing the truth in her words, but also a reticence, as if Adelaide feared stirring the waters. As she returned to the lobby, Inspector Slack intercepted her, his face grim. We've got something from the pier, he said, holding up a small evidence bag. Inside was a single earring, cheap and gaudy, matching the style Ruby wore. Found it wedged between the boards. Could be hers, could be someone else's. Miss Marple examined the earring, her mind racing. If it's Ruby's, it places her at the pier that night, and if it's Dinah's, it suggests she was there too. We must test it for traces, hair, skin, anything that might tell us more. Slack nodded, his respect for her growing. Already on it. I've also got a lead on Dinah Lee's last movements. She was seen near the quarry 2 days before Ruby's death, with a man, tall, dark hair, possibly Basil Blake. We're bringing him in for questioning. Miss Marple's eyes gleamed. Mr. Blake has been evasive, Inspector. His parties, his connection to Ruby, and now this sighting. He's a thread we must pull. As the day waned, Miss Marple returned to St. Mary Mead, her thoughts a whirl of clues. The second body had shifted the case, revealing a deeper layer of deception. Dinah Lee, dressed in Ruby's clothes, burned to obscure her identity, suggested a plan to mislead. But why? Was Dinah a witness, a rival, or a pawn in a larger scheme? The earring, the telephone call, the scratches on the back door, all pointed to a killer who was both bold and meticulous, weaving a web that ensnared 2 young lives. At Gossington Hall, Mrs. Bantry greeted her with a mix of excitement and dread. Jane, the village is in an uproar about this second girl. They're saying it's a maniac, targeting blondes. What do you make of it? Miss Marple settled into the drawing-room, her knitting resuming its steady rhythm. Not a maniac, Dolly, but a mind with a purpose. Dinah Lee's death was meant To hide rubies or to serve as a decoy? The killer miscalculated, placing Ruby's body in your library, a move that drew attention rather than deflected it. We are close, but we must be patient. Mrs. Bantry sighed, her hands twisting together. Patient? With 2 girls dead and the police trampling my roses? Jane, you're a marvel, but I hope you're right. Miss Marple smiled, her eyes on the fire. I am, Dolly. The web is tangled, but its centre is clear. Ruby and Dinah were linked by more than appearance, and someone feared what that link revealed. We shall find them in time. As the fire crackled, Miss Marple's needles moved, each stitch a step toward the truth, a truth that lay hidden in the shadows of Danemouth's glittering facade. Chapter 8. Unraveling Identities. The morning mist clung to the hedgerows of St. Mary Mead, softening the outlines of the village's cottages and lending an air of secrecy to the unfolding tragedy. At Gossington Hall, the Bantrys' home was quieter. Now, the police presence reduced to a single constable stationed at the gate. But the weight of Ruby Keane's murder, and now Dinah Lee's, hung heavy in the air. Miss Jane Marple sat in her modest cottage, her knitting needles idle for once, as she pored over her notes. The discovery of Dinah's body in the quarry, dressed in a dress identical to Ruby's, had shifted the case into a darker, more intricate puzzle. The scorched photograph, the earring at the pier, the mysterious telephone call, all were pieces of a mosaic that pointed to a calculated deception, one that Miss Marple was determined to unravel. Mrs. Dolly Bantry arrived at the cottage. Just after breakfast, her face flushed with a mix of excitement and apprehension. Jane, the village is positively aflame with talk about this Dinah Lee, she said, settling into a chintz-covered chair. They're saying she was Ruby's double, and now people are whispering about doppelgangers and mad killers. Have you made any sense of it? Miss Marple's eyes, bright behind her spectacles, met her friend's. Not a mad killer, Dolly, but a mind with a purpose. Dinah Lee's death was no accident, nor was her resemblance to Ruby. The killer used that likeness to create confusion, perhaps to delay the discovery of Ruby's murder. But the placement of Ruby's body in your library was a misstep, a bold, almost personal act that betrays their intent. Mrs. Bantry shivered, wrapping her scarf tighter. Personal? You mean someone wanted to hurt us, Arthur and me? Or to shield someone else, Miss Marple said, her voice soft but firm. The library was a stage, and Ruby's body the centrepiece. We must look to the players, Josie Turner, Mark Gaskell, Basil Blake, Conway Jefferson, and the secrets they guard. Dinah Lee is the key, and I suspect her connection to Ruby lies in a shared past, one Josie has been at pains to conceal. Christie's. Bantry leaned forward, her curiosity piqued. That photograph with the burned face. You think it's Dinah, don't you? And Josie's lying about it. I am certain of it, Miss Marple said, rising to fetch the photograph from her writing desk. She held it up, the scorched edge stark against the image of Ruby's laughing face. The damage was deliberate, meant to obscure Dinah's identity. Josie's dismissal of it as a school friend was too glib, and her reaction when pressed suggests fear, not ignorance. We must learn more about Dinah's life, and how she came to cross Ruby's path. Determined to pursue this lead, Miss Marple proposed a return to the majestic hotel, where the threads of the case converged. Mrs. Bantry, eager for action, agreed to accompany her, and soon they were in a taxi, winding through the misty lanes, to Danemouth. The hotel, though still a beacon of elegance, seemed diminished, its staff moving with a subdued wariness, and its guests casting furtive glances. Inspector Slack met them in the lobby, his notebook bulging with new reports, and his expression one of grim determination. "Miss Marple," he said, guiding them to a private sitting-room, "we've got more on Dinah Lee. She was a runaway, from a foster home in London, drifted to Danemouth about a month ago. Worked as a cleaner at the Majestic for a week before quitting, or being sacked depending on who you ask. The porter says she and Ruby had a heated argument in the staff corridor, something about a debt or a promise. Dinah was seen near the pier the day before Ruby's death, and we're still testing that earring for traces." Miss Marple's needles emerged, their click a steady counterpoint to her racing thoughts. "A debt or a promise," she murmured. "That aligns with Flo's account of their quarrel. And the dress, identical to Ruby's, suggests a deliberate attempt to confuse identities. Have you found any link between Dinah and Josie Turner?" Slack shook his head, his jaw tight. "Not yet. Josie's sticking to her story. Says she never met Dinah, doesn't know her. But I've got a man checking her background, and Ruby's for any overlap. They're cousins, so there might be a family connection." Miss Marple's gaze sharpened. "A family connection is likely, Inspector. Dinah's resemblance to Ruby is too striking to be mere chance. I'd suggest looking into their childhood, schools, foster homes, any shared acquaintances. And the telephone call Ruby received night before her death, have you traced it?" Slack nodded, flipping through his notes. The switchboard logged it as an outside line, no name attached. Clara, the operator, says it was a woman. Young, sounded agitated. We're trying to trace the exchange, but it's slow going. Miss Marple filed the information away, her mind turning to the pier. The note about a meeting at the pier, signed D, likely came from Dinah. If Ruby went there, she may have met her killer, or Dinah herself. We must reconstruct their final hours. Leaving Slack to his inquiries, Miss Marple and Mrs. Bantry sought out Josie Turner, who was in the hotel's office reviewing schedules for the gala's aftermath. Josie's sharp features were drawn, and her eyes held a flicker of defiance as she saw them approach. "Miss Marple, Mrs. Bantry," she said, her voice cool, "I've told you everything. This Dinah Lee business, it's got nothing to do with me." Miss Marple's smile was disarming, but her gaze was piercing. "I'm sure you believe that, Miss Turner, but Dinah's resemblance to Ruby and her presence at the hotel suggests a connection you may not wish to acknowledge. The photograph in Ruby's room, with its scorched face, was no accident. Was Dinah a relative, perhaps a distant cousin, known to you both?" Josie's hands clenched, her composure wavering. "I told you, it was just some girl. Ruby had lots of friends, lots of pictures. I don't know why it was burned, and I don't know any Dinah. You're wasting your time." Mrs. Bantry, unable to stay silent, interjected. "You're hiding something, Miss Turner. 2 girls are dead, and you're acting as if it's nothing. If you know who this Dinah was, you must speak." Josie's eyes flashed, but she steadied herself. "I'm not hiding anything. Ruby was my cousin, my family. I loved her, but she had her own life, her own secrets. If she knew this Dinah, she didn't tell me. Now please, I have work to do." Miss Marple touched Mrs. Bantry's arm, signalling restraint. Thank you, Miss Turner. If you think of anything, you know where to find us." As they left the office, Mrs. Bantry whispered, "She's lying, Jane. Did you see her hands? She's terrified." "Terrified, yes," Miss Marple said, her voice low. "But of what? Exposure or something darker? We must be patient, Dolly." Their next stop was the hotel's staff quarters, where Miss Marple hoped to speak with the porter who had overheard Ruby and Dinah's argument. The porter, a wiry man named Tom, was polishing silver in the pantry, his movements quick but distracted. He looked up as Miss Marple approached, his face wary. "Miss Marple, is it?" "The police already asked me about that row. I don't know much." "Any detail may help, Tom," Miss Marple said, her tone grandmotherly. "You heard Ruby and Dinah arguing, I believe. What was the nature of their dispute?" Tom hesitated, glancing around the empty pantry. "It was about a month ago. The staff corridor. I was sweeping, didn't mean to eavesdrop. Dinah was angry, said Ruby owed her something, money, I think, or a favour. Ruby snapped back, told her to keep her voice down, said she'd handle it. Dinah stormed off, and that was the last I saw of her." Miss Marple's eyes gleamed. "Money or a favour? Did Dinah mention anyone else? Perhaps a name or a place?" Tom frowned, thinking. She said something about he won't wait forever, but I didn't catch who he was. Ruby looked scared, though, not her usual self. I figured it was personal, so I kept out of it. Miss Marple thanked him, her mind turning over the new clue. A debt, a mysterious he, a frightened Ruby. These were threads that pointed to a deeper entanglement. She and Mrs. Bantry moved to the lounge, where Mark Gaskell was reading a newspaper, his casual demeanour at odds with the tension in his posture. Miss Marple approached, her smile polite. "Mr. Gaskell, I hope I'm not interrupting. I've a question about Dinah Lee, the girl found in the quarry. Did Ruby ever mention her to you?" Mark lowered the paper, his eyes narrowing. "Dinah Lee? No, never heard of her. Ruby was always talking about her plans, her dreams, but no one named Dinah. Why, what's she got to do with it?" Miss Marple watched him closely. She looked remarkably like Ruby, and they argued at the hotel. It's possible Ruby met her, the night she died, perhaps at the pier. You were playing cards that night, I believe." Mark's smile was tight. "Like I said, cards till 1, then bed with Josie. I didn't see Ruby after 11, and I don't know any Dinah. Sorry, Miss Marple, I'm not much help." Miss Marple nodded, unconvinced but gracious. "Thank you, Mr. Gaskell. If you recall anything, do let us know." Their final stop was Conway Jefferson's suite, where Adelaide Jefferson was reading aloud to her father-in-law. Conway's face brightened at Miss Marple's arrival, though his grief was palpable. "Miss Marple," he said, "any progress? This second girl, it's too much to bear." Miss Marple took a seat, her knitting resuming its steady rhythm. "We are making progress, Mr. Jefferson. Dinah Lee's death is linked to Ruby's, and I believe it stems from a secret they shared. Did Ruby ever hint at a debt, perhaps, or someone who pressed her for money?" Conway's brow furrowed. "A debt? No, she never mentioned anything like that. She was always cheerful, full of plans. But that telephone call I told you about, she was shaken after it. I thought it was a friend, but now I wonder." Adelaide, closing the book, added, "Ruby was careful with money, from what I saw. She'd save her tips, talk about buying a flat in London. If she owed someone, she didn't let on. Miss Marple thanked them, her mind weaving the clues into a pattern. The debt, the telephone call, the peer meeting, all suggested a pressure Ruby had faced, one that Dinah had exacerbated. As she and Mrs. Bantry left the hotel, Miss Marple's thoughts turned to Basil Blake, whose connection to Ruby and possible sighting with Dinah near the quarry made him a figure of interest. Back in St. Mary Mead, Miss Marple requested a meeting with Inspector Slack, who arrived at her cottage with news. "We've questioned Blake," he said, settling into a chair. "He admits knowing Ruby but denies meeting Dinah. Says he was at his bungalow the night Ruby died, with a dozen witnesses. But a neighbour saw his car near Gossington Hall at 3 a.m, and he can't explain it. We're holding him for now." Marple's eyes gleamed. "His car at 3 a.m. aligns with the dog's barking, Inspector. Basil may have been involved in moving Ruby's body, but I suspect he's not the mastermind. The dress on Dinah's body, the burning, it's too intricate for his impulsive nature. We must look to those with more to lose. Mark Gaskell, Josie Turner, perhaps even Adelaide." Slack nodded, his respect growing. "I've got men checking. Blake's car for traces, fibres, blood, anything. And we're digging into Dinah's foster records. She and Ruby were in the same home for a year, ages ago. Josie was there too, briefly, before she aged out." Miss Marple's needles paused, her mind racing. "A shared foster home," she said softly. "That explains the resemblance, perhaps a distant relation. Josie's silence is protective, but of whom? Herself or someone else?" As Slack left, Miss Marple turned to Mrs. Bantry, who had been listening intently. "Jane, you're close, aren't you?" she said, her eyes wide. "This foster home business, it's the link, isn't it?" "Close, but not there yet," Miss Marple said, her voice thoughtful. "Dinah and Ruby were bound by more than blood, I suspect. A debt, a secret, a man who wouldn't wait forever. The killer wove a web to hide Ruby's death, using Dinah as a decoy, but the library was their mistake. It draws us to the heart of their motive." Miss Marple resumed her knitting, her needles a metronome to her thoughts. The identities of Ruby and Dinah, so carefully obscured, were beginning to unravel, revealing a truth that lay in the interplay of greed, loyalty, and desperation. As the mist lifted over St. Mary Mead, she sensed the pattern was nearly complete, waiting only for the final stitch to bring it into focus. Chapter 9. The trap is set. The sun hung low over St. Mary Mead, casting a golden sheen across the village's quiet lanes and the sprawling grounds of Gossington Hall. The discovery of Dinah Lee's charred remains in the quarry had deepened the shadow over the investigation, transforming Ruby Keene's murder from a singular tragedy into a chilling conspiracy. Miss Jane Marple, seated in her cottage's small parlour, sipped a cup of tea, her knitting needles still for the moment as she reviewed the intricate web of clues. The scorched photograph, the earring at the pier, the shared foster home, and the deliberate misdirection of Dinah's body, all pointed to a killer who was both cunning and desperate, weaving a deception that had unravelled with Ruby's placement in the Bantrys' library. Mrs. Dolly Bantry burst into the parlour, her cheeks flushed from a brisk walk. "Jane, you'll never believe the talk in the village," she exclaimed, tossing her hat onto a side table. "They're saying Basil Blake's been arrested. and some are even whispering about a secret lover Ruby had, someone high up at the Majestic. Have you heard anything new from Inspector Slack?" Miss Marple set her teacup down, her eyes gleaming with quiet resolve. "Not arrested, Dolly, merely detained for questioning. Basil's car near Gossington Hall at 3 a.m. is troubling, but I suspect he's a pawn, not the mastermind. As for a secret lover, that's village gossip, though it may hold a grain of truth. The key lies in Dinah Lee's connection to Ruby, a connection Josie Turner is determined to conceal. We are close, but we need a catalyst to expose the truth. Bantry sank into a chair, her curiosity alight. "A catalyst? You mean a trap, don't you, Jane? Oh, do tell me you've a plan." Miss Marple's lips curved in a faint smile. "A plan, yes, but it requires precision. The killer believes they've outwitted us, using Dinah's body to obscure Ruby's death. But their choice of the library was a miscalculation, drawing attention to their motives. I propose we stage a confrontation at the Majestic, hinting at new evidence about Dinah Lee. The guilty will betray themselves if we watch closely." Mrs. Bantry clapped her hands, her eyes sparkling. "A confrontation, like in one of those detective novels. But who will you invite? Josie, Mark Gaskell, that dreadful Blake boy?" "All of them," Miss Marple said, her tone firm. "And Conway Jefferson, Adelaide, even Flo. Each has a piece of the puzzle, and their reactions will reveal the shape of the whole. I'll speak with Inspector Slack to arrange it." The plan took shape swiftly. Miss Marple telephoned Slack, who, though initially sceptical, agreed to her proposal, impressed by her insight into the case. He arranged for the key figures to gather at the Majestic's private dining room that evening, under the pretext of a police briefing on new evidence. Miss Marple, meanwhile, returned to her notes, tracing the threads that linked Ruby and Dinah, their shared foster home, the argument over a debt, the mysterious he mentioned by the porter, and the telephone call that had left Ruby shaken. The killer, she sensed, was driven by a need to protect Conway Jefferson's fortune. But the personal nature of the library's choice suggested a deeper motive, perhaps jealousy or betrayal. By late afternoon, Miss Marple and Mrs. Bantry arrived at the Majestic, where the hotel's polished facade masked a palpable tension. The private dining room, with its long mahogany table and crystal chandelier, was an elegant setting for what Miss Marple hoped would be a pivotal moment. Inspector Slack stood at the head of the table, his notebook open, while a constable guarded the door. The invited guests filed in, their expressions ranging from curiosity to unease. Conway Jefferson, wheeled in by Adelaide, looked frail but alert, his eyes searching the room. Adelaide, her delicate features composed, stayed close, her hands resting lightly on his chair. Mark Gaskell entered with Josie Turner, his charm subdued, while Josie's sharp gaze darted to Miss Marple, betraying a flicker of suspicion. Basil Blake, released from questioning but still under scrutiny, slouched in with a defiant air, his eyes bloodshot. Flo, the dance hostess, hovered near the back, her nervousness evident in her fidgeting hands. Inspector Slack cleared his throat, his voice cutting through the murmur. "Thank you for coming. We've new evidence in the murders of Ruby Keene and Dinah Lee, and we need your help to clarify some points. Miss Marple, a consultant on this case, will explain." All eyes turned to Miss Marple, who rose, her black lace cap slightly askew, her manner serene but commanding. "Good evening," she said, her voice clear. "The deaths of Ruby Keene and Dinah Lee are linked by a deliberate deception, one that began with Ruby's murder and ended in your library, Mr. and Mrs. Bantry. Dinah's body, dressed in Ruby's clothes and burned, was meant to be found first, creating the illusion that Ruby was dead elsewhere. But Ruby's body was placed in Gossington Hall, a bold act that points to the killer's motive." Conway Jefferson's hands tightened on his blanket, his voice hoarse. "Motive? Ruby was a sweet girl. Who could want her dead?" Miss Marple's gaze swept the room, noting each reaction. Ruby's charm and your affection, Mr. Jefferson, made her a threat. Your plan to adopt her, to leave her a substantial inheritance, altered the expectations of those around you. Mark Gaskell, with his debts, stood to lose a fortune. Josie Turner, your daughter-in-law, faced a diminished future for her dance business. Even Adelaide, devoted as she is, had her son's interests to consider. Mark's smile was tight, his voice sharp. "That's absurd. I liked Ruby, debts or no, and Josie's her cousin. She'd never hurt her." Josie's face paled, but she nodded. "Ruby was family. I'd have done anything for her, not against her." Adelaide's voice was soft but firm. "I wanted Conway's happiness. Ruby's adoption didn't change that." Miss Marple's eyes lingered on Basil Blake, who shifted uncomfortably. "And you, Mr. Blake? Your car was seen near Gossington Hall at 3 a.m. when Ruby's body was likely moved. You knew her well, danced with her, perhaps felt more than you've admitted." Basil's defiance faltered, his voice low. "I told you, I was at my place partying. I didn't move anybody. Yeah, I liked Ruby, but it wasn't serious. She was after bigger fish." Miss Marple nodded, her tone measured. "Then let us consider Dinah Lee. A runaway, briefly employed here. She resembled Ruby so closely that their likeness was exploited. A witness saw her argue with Ruby over a debt or promise, and a note in Ruby's room suggested a meeting at the pier, signed D. We now know Dinah and Ruby shared a foster home years ago, along with Josie. The scorched photograph in Ruby's room showing a girl whose face was burned was likely Dinah. Someone wanted her identity hidden. Josie's hands clenched, her voice trembling. "I've said it before, that photo was nothing. Ruby had lots of pictures. I don't know any Dinah Lee." Miss Marple's gaze was steady. Yet the porter heard Ruby and Dinah argue, and Flo saw them together. Dinah mentioned a he who wouldn't wait forever. Who was he, Miss Turner? A creditor, a lover, or someone closer to home? The room fell silent, the tension palpable. Mark's eyes darted to Josie, who stared at the table, her lips pressed tight. Adelaide's hands tightened on Conway's chair, while Basil lit a cigarette, his fingers unsteady. Flo, at the back, shifted nervously, her eyes wide. Inspector Slack stepped forward, holding up the earring found at the pier. This was Ruby's, confirmed by a hair caught in the clasp. It places her at the pier the night she died, likely meeting Dinah. We believe Ruby was killed there. Her body moved later. Dinah's death followed. Her body burned to confuse the timeline. Miss Marple took up the thread, her voice calm but relentless. The killer's plan was to make Dinah's body seem like Ruby's, delaying suspicion. But Ruby's placement in the library was a statement, perhaps to implicate the Bantrys, or to deflect from the true motive. That motive, I believe, lies in the interplay of greed and fear. Ruby's adoption threatened financial security, but Dinah's presence, her knowledge of Ruby's past, posed a different danger. Conway's voice broke the silence, his grief raw. "You're saying Ruby was killed for my money, and this poor girl, Dinah, because she knew too much?" Miss Marple's expression softened. "I fear so, Mr. Jefferson. But the killer underestimated the clarity of human nature. People reveal themselves even in their silence." She turned to Flo, who flinched under her gaze. "Miss Flo, you saw Dinah with Ruby, heard their argument. Did Ruby ever confide in you about a man? Perhaps someone who pressured her?" Flo's voice was barely audible. "She didn't confide, but I heard her once, on the phone, saying she'd pay him back soon. She sounded scared, said it was her fault Dinah got mixed up in it. I didn't ask, I didn't want trouble." Miss Marple nodded, her mind racing. "A debt, then, tying Ruby and Dinah to a third party. And the telephone call Mr. Jefferson overheard the night before Ruby's death. It was likely Dinah arranging the peer meeting." The room grew taut, each guest avoiding the other's eyes. Miss Marple's voice cut through the stillness. "Let us imagine a scenario. Ruby, ambitious but burdened by a debt, perhaps from her past, promised to repay it. Dinah, her foster sister, knew of this debt and demanded her share, threatening to expose Ruby to Mr. Jefferson. The peer meeting was a confrontation, but someone else was there. Someone who saw an opportunity to eliminate both threats. Ruby was killed. Her body moved to Gossington Hall. Dinah was killed later. Her body dressed as Ruby's and burned to create a false narrative." Mark's voice was sharp. "That's all speculation. You've no proof, Miss Marple. And why? The Bantrys' library? It makes no sense." Miss Marple's eyes met his, unflinching. "It makes sense if the killer knew the house, Mr. Gaskell. A duplicate key, a moment of distraction. Perhaps the dog's barking was ignored as a fox. The library was chosen to shock, to draw attention away from the hotel and its secrets." Josie's face crumpled, her voice a whisper. "Stop it. You don't know what you're saying. Ruby was my cousin. I'd never hurt her." Miss Marple's tone was gentle but firm. "I believe you loved her, Miss Turner, but love can blind us to others' actions. Someone close to you, perhaps someone you trust, saw Ruby as a barrier to their future." The room erupted in murmurs, with Conway's voice rising above the rest. "Enough! I can't bear this. Ruby was my hope, my chance to do good. If my money caused this, I'll give it all away." Adelaide's hand touched his shoulder, her voice soothing. "Conway, don't. We'll find the truth, I promise." Miss Marple watched the interplay, noting Josie's trembling hands, Mark's clenched jaw, Basil's averted gaze. The trap was set, and the guilty were stirring. She signalled to Slack, who nodded, his eyes scanning the room. "We'll be following. Up with each of you," he said, his tone authoritative. "Don't leave the hotel without informing us." As the guests dispersed, Miss Marple and Mrs. Bantry returned to the lobby, the weight of the confrontation settling over them. Mrs. Bantry's voice was hushed. "Jane, did you see Josie? She's breaking. And Mark, he looked ready to bolt. Did we get them?" "Not yet," Miss Marple said, her eyes on the chandelier's flickering light. "But we've shaken the web, Dolly. The guilty will act, and we must be ready." Back at her cottage, Miss Marple sat by the fire, her knitting resumed, each stitch a step toward clarity. The confrontation had exposed cracks, Josie's fear, Mark's defensiveness, Basil's unease, but the final piece was missing. The debt, the man who wouldn't wait forever, the choice of the library. All pointed to a motive rooted in both greed and intimacy. As the fire crackled, Miss Marple's thoughts crystallized. Ruby and Dinah, she murmured, were pawns in a game of wealth and betrayal. But the player is close, and their hand is faltering. The trap was set, and the truth, she knew, was poised to emerge from the shadows of Danemouth's glittering facade, ready to be caught in the quiet net of St. Mary Mead. Chapter 10. The Confession. The evening air in Danemouth carried a chill, despite the lingering warmth of the day, as the majestic hotel's grand facade glowed under the soft light of its lanterns. Inside, the private dining room where Miss Jane, Marple, had staged her confrontation, hours earlier, was now empty, its mahogany table cleared and its chandelier dimmed. The tension from that gathering, however, had not dissipated. It clung to the hotel's corridors, seeping into the hushed conversations of guests and the strained faces of the staff. Miss Marple, back at Gossington Hall with Mrs. Dolly Bantry, sat in the drawing-room, her knitting needles moving with their familiar rhythm, though her mind was far from serene. The trap she had set had stirred the guilty, and she sensed the moment of truth was near. Mrs. Bantry, pacing before the fireplace, was a bundle of nervous energy. "Jane, that meeting was positively electric," she exclaimed, her hands gesturing wildly. Josie looked like she might faint, and Mark Gaskell's eyes were everywhere but on you. And Basil Blake, such a sullen boy. Did you see how he flinched when you mentioned his car? Have we caught them, do you think? Miss Marple's eyes, bright behind her spectacles, met her friend's with a calm that belied the intensity of her thoughts. "We've shaken them, Dolly, but the net is not yet closed. The guilty are rattled, and rattled people make mistakes. Josie's fear, Mark's defensiveness, Basil's unease, they're all threads in the web, but we need a final tug to reveal the pattern. I expect something to break tonight." Mrs. Bantry stopped pacing, her eyes wide. "Tonight? You mean one of them might confess? Or, oh, Jane, you don't think they'll try something desperate, do you?" Miss Marple's needles paused, and she looked up, her expression thoughtful. "Desperation is the killer's hallmark, Dolly. Ruby Keene's murder was planned, but Dinah Lee's was a reaction, a frantic attempt to cover tracks. The library was their boldest stroke, meant to mislead, but it's also their weakness. We must watch and wait." The telephone rang, shattering the room's quiet. Mrs. Bantry answered, her face tightening as she listened. "It's Inspector Slack," she said, handing the receiver to Miss Marple. "He sounds urgent." Miss Marple took the phone, her voice steady. "Yes, Inspector. What's happened?" Slack's voice was clipped, laced with excitement. "Miss Marple, we've had a breakthrough. Josie Turner's just come to the station, says she wants to talk. She's in a state, crying, shaking the lot. I'm heading there now. Can you join me?" Miss Marple's eyes gleamed. "I'll be there directly, Inspector. Keep her calm and don't press her too hard until I arrive." She hung up, turning to Mrs. Bantry. "Josie's breaking, Dolly. This is the moment we've been waiting for. Will you come?" Mrs. Bantry nodded, her apprehension giving way to resolve. I wouldn't miss it for the world, Jane. The taxi ride to the Danimouth police station was swift, the misty lanes flashing by as Miss Marple's mind raced. Josie's decision to come forward suggested a crack in her defences, perhaps spurred by the confrontation's pressure. The scorched photograph, Dinah's resemblance, the shared foster home, all pointed to a secret Josie had guarded, one tied to Ruby's death and Dinah's tragic end. Miss Marple sensed that the truth, long obscured, was about to emerge. At the station, a small utilitarian building with flickering fluorescent lights, Inspector Slack met them in the reception area. His face was flushed, his notebook already open. "She's in the interview room," he said, leading them down a corridor. "She's been babbling about Ruby Dinah and some debt. I haven't started questioning her yet. Thought you'd want to hear it fresh." Miss Marple nodded, her expression serene, but her mind alert. "You were wise to wait, Inspector. Josie's state suggests she's ready to unburden herself, but we must tread carefully. A confession, if it comes, will be fragile." The interview room was stark, with a metal table, 2 chairs, and a single window barred against the night. Josie Turner sat hunched at the table, her sharp features softened by tear-streaked makeup, her hands twisting a handkerchief. She looked up as Miss Marple and Slack entered, her eyes red and desperate. Mrs. Bantry, at Miss Marple's insistence, remained outside, observing through a one-way glass. "Miss Turner," Miss Marple said, taking a seat opposite her, "you've done a brave thing, coming here. You want to tell us about Ruby and Dinah, don't you?" Josie's lips trembled, and she nodded, her voice barely audible. "I can't keep it in anymore. It's eating me up. Ruby, she didn't deserve to. And Dinah, oh God, Dinah was my fault." Miss Marple's tone was gentle, almost maternal. "Start at the beginning, my dear. Tell us about Dinah and how she came into Ruby's life." Josie took a shuddering breath, her eyes fixed on the table. "Dinah Lee was our foster sister, years ago in London. Me, Ruby, and Dinah. We were in the same home for a year, when Ruby was 12 and Dinah was 10. I was older, almost out of the system. We were close, like real sisters, but life pulled us apart. I got work, Ruby went to another home, and Dinah, she ran away, got into trouble. I didn't see her again until a month ago, here in Danimouth." Miss Marple nodded, her knitting bag at her feet, though she made no move to retrieve it. "And how did Dinah find Ruby?" Josie's hands clenched the handkerchief. She turned up at the Majestic looking for work. She was a mess, thin, scared, living hand to mouth. Ruby recognized her, got her a job as a cleaner, but Dinah was angry. She said Ruby owed her from back then. They'd made a pact, as kids, to share whatever they got if one of them made it big. Ruby was on her way up with Conway's money, and Dinah wanted her share. Miss Marple's eyes sharpened. The argument the porter overheard, about a debt or a promise, that was Dinah's demand? Josie nodded, tears spilling down her cheeks. Yes, Ruby tried to help, gave her money, but Dinah kept pushing. She said she'd tell Conway about Ruby's past. Petty theft, lies, things we did to survive. Ruby was terrified he'd turn her away. They fought, and Dinah left, but she kept coming back, calling, demanding more. Miss Marple's voice was steady. The telephone call Conway overheard the night before Ruby's death. That was Dinah, wasn't it? And the note, arranging a meeting at the pier. Josie's voice broke. Yes, Dinah called, said she needed to see Ruby one last time. Ruby went to the pier, thinking she could reason with her. I told her not to go, but she wouldn't listen. She said she'd fix it like always. Miss Marple leaned forward, her gaze piercing. And what happened at the pier, Josie? Who was there? Josie's sobs grew louder, her words tumbling out. I don't know, not for sure. Ruby didn't come back. And the next morning, she was dead in the Bantrys library. I thought Dinah did it, out of spite. But then Dinah's body was found, and I knew it was bigger than that. Someone used Dinah to cover it up, to make it look like Ruby died somewhere else. Miss Marple's tone remained gentle, but unrelenting. And the photograph, Josie? Why was Dinah's face burned? Josie's hands shook, her voice a whisper. I did that. After Ruby died, I went to her room, looking for anything that might point to Dinah. I found the picture, Ruby and Dinah laughing from the foster home. I panicked. If the police saw it, they'd dig into our past, and I couldn't let that happen. I burned Dinah's face, thinking it'd stop questions. Inspector Slack, who had been silent, leaned forward, his voice sharp. You tampered with evidence, Miss Turner. That's serious. And you're saying you had no part in the murders? Josie's head snapped up, her eyes fierce. I didn't kill them. I loved Ruby, and Dinah was my sister too, in a way. I was trying to protect Ruby's memory, to keep Conway from knowing the mess she'd been in. Miss Marple's gaze softened, but her questions pressed on. Protecting Ruby? Or someone else? You're married to Mark Gaskell, who stood to lose a fortune if Ruby was adopted. Did he know about Dinah's demands? Josie's face crumpled, her voice barely audible. Mark knew Ruby was trouble, but I never told him about Dinah. He's got his faults, debts, gambling, but he wouldn't kill. He was with me that night in our room after the card game. Miss Marple's eyes narrowed. And Basil Blake? His car was seen near Gossington Hall, and he was close to Ruby. Did he ever mention Dinah? Josie shook her head, her tears slowing. Basil was a fool, chasing Ruby, throwing his parties. She liked him, but it was a game to her. I don't know about his car. I don't know anything about that night. Miss Marple sat back, her mind weaving the threads of Josie's confession. The foster home, the debt, the peer meeting, all clarified the connection between Ruby and Dinah. But the killer's identity remained elusive. Josie's tampering with the photograph was a desperate act, but her love for Ruby seemed genuine. The library, the burned body, the earring, these were the work of a colder mind, one that had exploited Dinah's resemblance to Ruby. Inspector Slack, sensing the moment, pressed harder. Miss Turner, if you're holding back, now's the time to speak. We've got Blake in custody, and Gaskell's alibi is thin. If you know who killed them, say it. Josie's sobs returned, her voice breaking. I don't know. I swear I don't. But Mark was angry about Ruby, about Conway's money. He said things, cruel things, but I didn't think he'd act. And Basil, he was at the hotel that night before the pier. I saw him talking to Ruby, looking upset. That's all I know. Miss Marple's gaze shifted to Slack, a silent signal to ease off. She rose, her voice gentle. Thank you, Josie. You've helped more than you know. Rest now, and let us handle the rest." As they left the interview room, Mrs. Bantry, who had watched through the glass, joined them, her face pale. "Jane, she's telling the truth, isn't she? But it's not enough, is it?" "Not quite," Miss Marple said, her tone thoughtful. "Josie's confession clears the fog, but the killer is still in shadow. Mark Gaskell's anger, Basil's presence at the hotel, these are leads we must follow. And the library, Dolly, it remains the key. Why your home? Why that room?" Back at the station's reception, Slack pulled Miss Marple aside, his voice low. "We've got new evidence from Blake's car. Fibres matching the rug in the Bantrys library, and a trace of Ruby's perfume. He's denying everything, but it's damning. And Gaskell's alibi, Josie says they were together, but the hotel staff can't confirm it after midnight. What's your take?" Miss Marple's eyes gleamed. "Basil moved the body, Inspector, I'm certain of it. His car, the fibres, it's too precise. But I doubt he killed Ruby. He's impulsive, not calculating. Mark Gaskell, however, has motive and opportunity. His debts, his fear of losing Conway's fortune, these are powerful drivers, and yet the library suggests a personal connection, someone who knew the Bantrys' routines." Slack nodded, scribbling furiously. "I'll bring Gaskell in, lean on him, and Blake, we'll charge him as an accessory if he doesn't talk. Anything else?" Miss Marple's voice was soft but firm. "Return to the Majestic, Inspector. Watch Mark closely, and Adelaide Jefferson too. Her quiet devotion may hide more than we've seen. And check the hotel's guest logs for any visitors the night Ruby died. Someone who might have followed her to the pier." As Slack departed, Miss Marple and Mrs. Bantry returned to Gossington Hall, the night closing in around them. The drawing room was warm, the fire crackling, but Mrs. Bantry's nerves were frayed. "Jane, it's all so close, yet so far. Josie's story, Dinah as their foster sister, the debt, it's heartbreaking. But who killed them? Mark? Basil? Someone we haven't even thought of." Miss Marple resumed her knitting, the needles a metronome to her thoughts. "The killer is among those we've met, Dolly. Mark Gaskell's greed is a strong motive, but his charm masks calculation. Basil's involvement is clearer now, but he's a follower, not a leader. Josie's love for Ruby blinded her to the truth, but she's not the architect. The library, though, it's the clue that binds them. Someone knew your home, your habits, and used them to stage a drama." Mrs. Bantry's eyes widened. "You think it's someone close to us? A servant, a neighbour?" "Not a servant," Miss Marple said, her voice low, "but someone who could access a key or exploit a moment of inattention. The scratches on the back door, the dogs barking, these suggest a plan executed with care, yet flawed by haste." The telephone rang again, and Mrs. Bantry answered, her face tightening. "It's Slack," she said, passing the receiver. "He's at the Majestic." Miss Marple took the phone, her heart quickening. "Yes, Inspector." Slack's voice was urgent. "Miss Marple, Gaskell's cracked. We brought him in, showed him the evidence, Josie's statement, the car fibres, the perfume. He's blaming Basil, says he saw him with Ruby at the pier, arguing. Says Basil was jealous, wanted Ruby for himself, and lost control. But Gaskell's shaky, keeps contradicting himself about his own movements." Miss Marple's mind raced. "And Basil, what does he say?" "He's talking now," Slack said. admits he drove to Gossington Hall, says he was paid to move Ruby's body, but swears he didn't kill her. Won't say who paid him, yet. We're working on him." Miss Marple's voice was calm but commanding. "Bring them both to the Majestic, Inspector, and gather the others, Josie, Adelaide, Conway. I'll be there within the hour. The truth is breaking, and we must catch it." She hung up, turning to Mrs. Bantry, who was practically bouncing with anticipation. "Jane, it's happening, isn't it? You've got them!" "We're close, Dolly," Miss Marple said, rising. "Mark and Basil are turning on each other, but the mastermind is still veiled. The library, the debt, the foster home, these are the keys. Let's go." The taxi ride to the Majestic was tense, the misty night enveloping the car as Miss Marple's thoughts crystallized. At the hotel, the private dining room was reconvened. The same cast of players gathered under the chandelier's glow, but the atmosphere was electric with fear and accusation. Conway Jefferson, pale but resolute, sat at the table's head, Adelaide at his side. Josie, her eyes red from crying, clung to Mark's arm, though his face was drawn, his charm gone. Basil slouched in a corner, his defiance crumbling. Slack stood by the door, his constable ready to act. Miss Marple took the floor, her presence commanding despite her frail appearance. "We are at the end of this sad affair," she said, her voice clear. "Ruby Keene and Dinah Lee died because of greed and fear. Ruby, poised to inherit Conway's fortune, was a threat to those who depended on it. Dinah, her foster sister, knew of a debt Ruby owed, a secret that could ruin her. The killer saw a chance to eliminate both, using Dinah's resemblance to create a false narrative." She turned to Mark, her gaze unflinching. "Mr. Gaskell, your debts made Ruby's adoption intolerable. You knew of her past, her vulnerabilities, and you saw Dinah as a tool. You followed Ruby to the pier, didn't you? And when Dinah appeared, you killed Ruby, then Dinah, dressing her in Ruby's clothes to confuse the timeline." Mark's face twisted, his voice rising. "That's a lie. I was here with Josie. Basil's the one. He was at the pier, fighting with Ruby. He moved her body, not me." Basil leapt up, his voice hoarse. "You paid me, Gaskell. You said it was a prank to scare the Bantrys. I didn't know she was dead till I got there." The room erupted, Josie's sobs mingling with Conway's shocked cry. Miss Marple raised a hand, her voice cutting through the chaos. "Enough! Mark Gaskell killed Ruby to secure Conway's fortune, exploiting Dinah's presence to stage a deception. Basil, infatuated but weak, was paid to move the body, believing it a jest. The library was chosen to implicate the Bantrys, deflecting suspicion from the hotel, but the truth, as always, reveals itself." Slack stepped forward, his handcuffs ready. "Mark Gaskell, Basil Blake, you're under arrest. We'll sort the details at the station." As the constable led them away, Josie collapsed, her grief raw. Adelaide supported Conway, her face pale but composed. Miss Marple watched, her heart heavy but her mind clear. The trap had sprung, and the web was undone. Back at Gossington Hall, Mrs. Bantry poured tea, her hands trembling. "Jane, you did it, but how did you know it was Mark?" Miss Marple resumed her knitting, her voice soft. "Greed, Dolly, and the library. Mark's debts, his access to the hotel, his knowledge of Ruby's past. It all pointed to him. Basil's role was secondary, a tool of convenience. The library was the clue, a place Mark knew from visits, a stage to shift blame. Human nature, my dear, is never as hidden as it seems. Chapter 11. The Aftermath. The morning sun rose over St. Mary Mead with a tentative grace, its rays piercing the mist that clung to the village's ancient lanes and thatched cottages. Gossington Hall, so recently the epicentre of a grim drama, stood quiet, its ivy-clad walls absorbing the light as if to cleanse itself of the scandal that had unfolded within. The arrests of Mark Gaskell and Basil Blake the previous night had sent ripples through the community, and the air buzzed with whispers of shock, relief, and morbid curiosity. Inside the hall, Miss Jane Marple sat in the drawing-room, her knitting needles moving with their familiar rhythm, though her mind was occupied with the delicate task of tying the case's loose ends. Mrs. Dolly Bantry, seated opposite her friend, was a study in restless triumph. Her hands fluttered over a tray of toast and marmalade, and her eyes sparkled with the thrill of resolution. "Jane, it's almost too much to believe," she said, her voice vibrant with excitement. "Mark, Gaskell and Basil Blake caught in your trap. The village is agog. Mrs. Price was at the door at 7, demanding details, and Cooks had to fend off 2 reporters already. But tell me, how are you feeling? You've solved it all, haven't you?" Miss Marple's needles paused, and her mild eyes, bright behind her spectacles, met Mrs. Bantry's with a serene expression that masked a lingering unease. "Solved, yes, Dolly, but every solution carries an aftermath. Mark Gaskell's greed and Basil Blake's folly led to the deaths of Ruby Keene and Dinah Lee. But the pain they caused, for Conway Jefferson, for Josie Turner, for you and the Colonel, cannot be so easily mended. We have the truth, but we must now ensure its justice is served with care." Mrs. Bantry's enthusiasm dimmed slightly, her brow furrowing. "Justice, of course. But Josie, poor Josie, she wasn't charged, was she? I felt for her last night, sobbing her heart out. She didn't kill anyone, did she?" Miss Marple resumed her knitting, her needles clicking softly. "No, Josie is not charged with murder, though her silence about the photograph and Dinah's identity complicated matters. Her love for Ruby was genuine, but her fear of exposing their past led her to shield Mark's actions, if only by omission. She'll face questions, perhaps even a charge for tampering with evidence. But her punishment is more personal, the loss of her cousin and the betrayal of her husband." The drawing-room door opened, admitting Colonel Arthur Bantry, his moustache bristling with a newfound lightness despite the ordeal. "Jane Marple, you're a wizard," he declared, settling into an armchair with a newspaper. "Slack's just been on the phone. Says Gaskell's confessing to everything, trying to pin the worst of it on Blake. The boy's still blustering, but they've got him cold with the car evidence. The village'll be talking of this for years, but I'm just glad our library's clear." Miss Marple smiled, her tone gentle. "I'm relieved for you, Colonel. The choice of your library was a cruel stroke, meant to shock and mislead, but it was also the killer's error. It drew our eyes to the truth, to the connections that led us here." Mrs. Bantry leaned forward, her curiosity undimmed. "But why the library, Jane? Mark Gaskell barely knew us. A few garden parties, a nod at the village fete. How did he know the house well enough to sneak in?" Miss Marple's eyes drifted to the window, where the lawn stretched toward the village. Mark Gaskell was a guest at your last summer fete, wasn't he? He and Josie mingled with the guests, and I recall you mentioning his interest in the hall's history, asking about its old keys and locks. He was charming, you said, but observant. The scratches on the back door, the dogs barking at 3, these suggest he or Basil used a duplicate key, perhaps picked the lock in a moment of haste. The library was chosen for its drama, a public room to deflect suspicion from the majestic, but it required inside knowledge Mark gleaned from his visits. Colonel Bantry's eyebrows shot up, his voice tinged with indignation. The cheek of the man, snooping at my fate, then using my library for his dirty work. I'll have those locks changed, mark my words. Miss Marple's smile was faint, but warm. A wise precaution, Colonel. But locks alone cannot guard against human nature, and it's human nature that drove this crime. Greed, fear, love twisted into betrayal. The telephone rang, and Mrs. Bantry answered, her face brightening as she listened. It's Conway Jefferson, she said, passing the receiver to Miss Marple. He wants to see you, Jane, at the Majestic. Says it's important. Miss Marple took the phone, her voice steady. Good morning, Mr. Jefferson. How may I help? You? Conway's voice was weary but resolute, carrying the weight of his grief. Miss Marple, I owe you more than I can say. You found Ruby's killer and Dinah's. I'd like to thank you in person, and there's something I need to discuss. Can you come to the hotel? Miss Marple agreed, sensing the urgency in his tone. She hung up, turning to Mrs. Bantry. Conway's summons suggests he's grappling with the aftermath, Dolly. I'd like you to come. We may learn more about the ripples of this crime. Mrs. Bantry, ever eager, nodded enthusiastically, and soon they were in a taxi, winding through the misty lanes to Danemouth. The Majestic Hotel, though still grand, bore the scars of the investigation. Guests spoke in hushed tones, and the staff moved with a subdued caution. Mr. Prescott, the manager, greeted them in the lobby, his polished demeanor strained by the recent upheavals. Miss Marple, Mrs. Bantry, he said. Mr. Jefferson's in his suite. He's been quiet since last night, but he insisted on seeing you. They ascended to Conway's suite, a spacious set of rooms overlooking the sea, where the invalid sat in his wheelchair, his face etched with sorrow, but his eyes clear with purpose. Adelaide Jefferson stood beside him, her delicate hands folded, her expression one of quiet strength. Conway gestured them to sit, his voice steady despite its tremor. Miss Marple, he said, your clarity saved us from a darkness I can't fathom. Ruby was my hope, a chance to do good after so much loss. To know she died for my money, it's a wound I'll carry always. But I want to make amends for her and for Dinah Lee. I've decided to set up a trust in Ruby's name for girls like her, dreamers with no one to lift them up. I'd value your advice on how to begin. Miss Marple's eyes softened, touched by his resolve. That's a noble gesture, Mr. Jefferson. Ruby's spirit was one of ambition and kindness, and such a trust would honour her memory. I'd suggest consulting a local charity, perhaps one tied to the arts, to ensure the funds reach those who need them most. Adelaide's voice was soft but firm. Conway's determined, Miss Marple, and I'll help, for my son's sake as much as Ruby's. This tragedy has shown us how fragile hope can be." Miss Marple nodded, her gaze shifting to Adelaide. "Your devotion to Mr. Jefferson is admirable, Mrs. Jefferson. During our confrontation, you were steadfast, yet I sensed you carried a private burden. Is there anything you wish to share, now that the truth is out?" Adelaide's hands tightened briefly, but her composure held. "Only that I feared for Conway, Miss Marple. Ruby's death, then Dinah's. It felt like a storm closing in. Mark's restlessness, Josie's silences. I saw the cracks but didn't know their depth. I'm grateful you did." Conway reached for Adelaide's hand, his voice heavy. "Adelaide's been my rock, and Mark, my own son-in-law, betrayed us all. I trusted him, thought his charm was harmless. To think he killed Ruby, used Dinah as a pawn. I'll never forgive myself for not seeing it." Miss Marple's tone was gentle but probing. "You couldn't have known, Mr. Jefferson. Mark's greed was hidden, even from Josie. But Dinah's role, her foster connection to Ruby and Josie, suggests a past that shaped this crime. Did Ruby ever hint at troubles from her childhood? Perhaps a figure who lingered in her life?" Conway frowned, his eyes distant. She was guarded about her past, always focusing on the future. But once she mentioned a man from her foster days, someone who'd helped her and Josie, then vanished. She said it casually, but there was a shadow in her eyes. I didn't press her. Miss Marple filed the detail away, sensing it was a thread worth pursuing. "A man from their past," she murmured. "It may explain the debt Dinah pressed Ruby to repay. Thank you, Mr. Jefferson. Your trust will be Ruby's legacy, and I'll do what I can to guide it." As they left the suite, Mrs. Bantry whispered, "Jane, that man Ruby mentioned. Do you think he's connected to Mark or Basil? Could he be the he Dinah spoke of, who wouldn't wait forever?" "It's possible," Miss Marple said, her voice low. "But Mark's motive, Conway's fortune, was clear, and Basil's role as his tool fits the evidence. The man from their past may be a shadow, not the killer. We must focus on what we know." Their next stop was the police station, where Inspector Slack had promised an update on the case's progress. The station was a hive of activity, with constables sorting files and reporters loitering outside. Slack met them in his office, his face weary but triumphant, his notebook brimming with fresh entries. "Miss Marple," he said, gesturing to chairs, "you've done it again. Gaskell's confessed to Ruby's murder, says it was spur of the moment at the pier when she refused to back off Conway's adoption. He claims Dinah was there, saw it all, and he panicked, killed her too. Dressed her in Ruby's clothes, burned her body to buy time. Basil, he says, was just a dupe, paid to move Ruby's body to the library, thinking it was a prank." Miss Marple's eyes narrowed. "And Basil's account?" Slack flipped through his notes. "He's sticking to his story. Says Gaskell offered him cash to drive the body to Gossington Hall. Swore it was a joke to scare the Bantrys. He's shaken. Admits he suspected foul play, but was too scared to back out. We've got him on accessory charges, and Gaskell's facing 2 counts of murder." Mrs. Bantry, unable to stay silent, interjected, "But why the library, Inspector? Jane says it was personal, but Mark hardly knew us." Slack nodded, his respect for Miss Marple evident. "That's where your insight came in, Miss Marple. Gaskell admitted he'd been to your fete, noticed the library's layout and the back door's lock. He got a key copied from a tradesman's visit. Your gardener's boy, careless with the spares. The library was chosen to throw us off, make it look like a village crime, not a hotel one. Miss Marple's needles, now in her hands, clicked softly. A calculated choice, but flawed. The library drew attention to the Bantrys, but also to Mark's access. And Josie's role? Has she clarified her actions? Slack's expression darkened. She's cooperating, facing a charge for tampering with the photograph. Says she burned Dinah's face to protect Ruby's reputation. Feared their foster past would taint Conway's view. She's no killer, but her silence helped Gaskell. She's broken, though. Blames herself for not seeing Mark's true nature. Miss Marple's gaze was thoughtful. Josie's love for Ruby was her blind spot, Inspector, and the man from their foster past, mentioned by Conway. Have you looked into him? Slack shook his head. Not yet, but we're checking foster records. Could be a red herring, given Gaskell's confession. Anything else you want us to chase? Miss Marple's voice was soft but firm. Only a final detail, Inspector. The earring at the pier. Have you confirmed it was Ruby's? Slack nodded, producing an evidence bag. Hair and skin traces match Ruby. It fell during the struggle. We think seals the pier as the murder scene. Miss Marple thanked him, her mind satisfied, but still probing the edges of the case. As they left the station, Mrs. Bantry's voice was hushed. Jane, it's really over, isn't it? Mark and Basil, caught, and Josie's paying her price. But I can't shake the feeling there's more. That man from their past, maybe. Miss Marple's smile was enigmatic. The case is closed, Dolly, but human stories never truly end. The man may be a shadow, a figure who shaped Ruby and Dinah's choices, but not their deaths. Mark's greed, Basil's weakness, these were the forces that drove the crime. We've done our part. Back at Gossington Hall, the Bantrys insisted on a celebratory tea, with scones and clotted cream laid out in the drawing-room. Colonel Bantry, his spirits restored, raised a cup to Miss Marple. To Jane Marple, who saved our name and caught a killer. You're a marvel, my dear. Miss Marple's cheeks pinked, but her tone was modest. I only saw what was there, Colonel. People leave patterns like stitches in a scarf, and the truth emerges if you follow them. Mrs. Bantry, buttering a scone, pressed her. But what now, Jane? The village will want to hear every detail, and Conway's trust. Will you help him? Miss Marple's needles resumed their rhythm, her eyes on the fire. I'll offer what guidance I can, Dolly. As for the village, let them talk. It's their way of healing. Ruby and Dinah are at peace, and we've ensured their killer. Faces justice, that's enough. As the fire crackled, Miss Marple's thoughts drifted to the quiet patterns of St. Mary Mead, where secrets lurked beneath the surface, waiting for a keen eye to unravel them. The aftermath was bitter, but it carried the promise of renewal, a promise she would nurture stitch by careful stitch in the heart of her village. Chapter 12. A Quiet Reflection. The autumn leaves drifted lazily across the lanes of St. Mary Mead, their golden hues a stark contrast to the sombre events that had unfolded over the past weeks. Gossington Hall, once a stage for tragedy, had regained its quiet dignity, its windows gleaming in the crisp morning light as if to proclaim its return to normalcy. The arrests of Mark Gaskell and Basil Blake, coupled with Josie Turner's anguished confession, had brought closure to the murders of Ruby Keene and Dinah Lee. Yet the village remained abuzz with whispers, each retelling of the tale adding a layer of myth to the grim reality. In her modest cottage on the high street, Miss Jane Marple sat by her parlour window, a half-finished scarf in her lap, her knitting needles still as she gazed at the garden, her mind weaving through the aftermath of the case. The village, with its familiar rhythms, the clatter of the postman's bicycle, the distant bleat of sheep, the soft tolling of St. Mary's bell, was a tapestry of constancy. Yet Miss Marple knew its surface hid currents of human passion and frailty. The resolution of Ruby's and Dinah's deaths had restored order, but it had also exposed the delicate threads that bound St. Mary Mead to the wider world of Danemouth's opulence and deceit. She sipped her tea, the steam curling in the air, and reflected on the lessons etched into her memory by this affair. Greed's corrosive reach, love's blinding devotion, and the subtle clues left by those who believed themselves unseen. A knock at the door broke her reverie, and Miss Marple rose, smoothing her skirt, to admit Mrs. Dolly Bantry, who swept in with her usual vigour, a basket of apples from Gossington's orchard in her arms. "Jane, you're a sight for sore eyes," she exclaimed, setting the basket on the table and flopping into a chintz chair. "The village is still reeling, you know. Mrs. Wiggins at the shop swears she always thought Mark Gaskell was shifty, and the rector's planning a memorial for Ruby Keene, though he's in a flap about how to phrase it. Have you been hiding away, or are you just letting us all stew in our excitement?" Miss Marple's lips curved in a gentle smile, her eyes bright with amusement. "Hiding, Dolly? Hardly. I've merely been taking my time, letting the dust settle. The village needs its stories, but I prefer to watch them unfold from the quiet of my parlour. Tell me, Miss Marple, how are you and the Colonel faring now that your home is your own again?" Mrs. Bantry's face softened, though her hands gestured expansively. "Oh, Arthur, he's back to his fishing rods, and his grumbling about the government, which is as good as a tonic. The hall feels lighter, Jane, though I'll never look at the library the same way. We've had the locks changed, mind you, and Rover's got a new basket by the back door. He's quite the hero barking at that scoundrel Gaskell. But what about you? You cracked the case, yet you're sitting here as if it were just another Tuesday." Miss Marple resumed her knitting, the needles clicking softly, a metronome to her thoughts. "Every case leaves its mark, Dolly, but my work is done when the truth is laid bare. Mark Gaskell's greed, Basil Blake's weakness, Josie Turner's misguided loyalty, these were the forces that wove this tragedy. Ruby and Dinah were caught in their net, but we've freed their story, and justice will follow its course." Mrs. Bantry leaned forward, her curiosity undimmed. "Justice, yes, but I keep thinking about Josie. She's not in prison, is she? I saw her in Danemouth yesterday, pale as a ghost, leaving the Majestic. She looked lost, Jane. What's to become of her?" Miss Marple's needles paused, her gaze drifting to the garden, where a blackbird pecked at the fallen apples. "Josie faces no murder charge, Dolly, but her tampering with the photograph may bring a fine or probation. Her true punishment is deeper. The loss of Ruby, the betrayal by Mark, the weight of her silence. She's resigned from the Majestic, I hear, and plans to leave Danemouth. Perhaps she'll find peace elsewhere, though guilt is a heavy companion." Mrs. Bantry sighed, her hands twisting a napkin. Poor girl. And Conway Jefferson? His trust for Ruby. Will it go ahead? Miss Suit, Marple nodded, her expression warm. Conway's resolve is unshaken. He's working with a solicitor to establish the trust, focusing on young women with artistic ambitions like Ruby. Adelaide is helping, and I've offered a few suggestions. Local charities, a scholarship fund. It's a fitting legacy, one that will outshine the darkness of this affair. The conversation turned to the village's recovery, with Mrs. Bantry recounting the latest gossip. The gardener's boy, chastened for his carelessness with the keys, had been sent to work in a neighbouring town. The rector's memorial service was set for next Sunday, with a discreet plaque planned for the churchyard, and Basil Blake's bungalow, now deserted, was up for sale, its modern angles already drawing curious buyers. The village moves on, Mrs. Bantry said, but it'll never forget Jane. You're a hero, you know, though you'll never admit it. Miss Marple's cheeks pinked, but her tone was modest. A hero, Dolly? I'm merely an observer, with a knack for seeing patterns. The hero is truth itself, which always finds a way, if we listen. The morning passed in companionable chatter, with Mrs. Bantry pressing Miss Marple for details of the confrontation at the Majestic, marvelling at how Josie's confession and Mark's unraveling had sealed the case. That moment when Basil admitted moving the body, she said, I could scarcely breathe. And Mark, blaming him, it was like a play, Jane, with you as the director. Miss Marple smiled, her needles moving steadily. Life is often a play, Dolly, with each of us acting our part. Mark Gaskell played the charming rogue, but his greed was his curtain call. Basil, the reckless youth, was swayed by coin and fear. Josie, the loyal cousin, was blinded by love. The library was their stage, but they forgot the audience. People like us, who notice when the lines don't ring true. Mrs. Bantry's eyes widened, a new thought striking her. The library. Jane, you said it was personal, a choice that pointed to Mark. But what if there was another reason? Could someone else have suggested it, someone we missed? Miss Marple's needles paused, her gaze thoughtful. An intriguing question, Dolly, but the evidence points to Mark. His visits to Gossington Hall, his knowledge of the fate, the copied key, these were his tools. The library's choice was strategic, meant to shock and shift blame. But it was also his undoing, tying him to the Bantrys' world. Another hand might have stirred the pot, but Mark held the reins. The mention of another hand brought Miss Marple's thoughts to the shadowy figure from Ruby and Dinah's foster past, the man Conway had mentioned, who had helped them and then vanished. Inspector Slack's inquiries had found no trace of him in the foster records, and Miss Marple suspected he was a peripheral influence. Perhaps the source of the debt Dinah pressed Ruby to repay, but not the killer. Shadows linger. Shig murmured, but the light of truth is stronger. Mrs. Bantry, sensing her friend's introspection, changed tack. What now, Jane? You've solved the case, Conway's trust is underway, and the village is settling. Will you take a rest? Perhaps a holiday? You deserve it after all this. Miss Marple's smile was enigmatic, her eyes drifting to the garden, where the blackbird had flown, leaving a scattering of apple seeds. A holiday, Dolly? Perhaps, but St. Mary Mead is my haven, and its quiet holds more stories than any seaside resort. I'll knit, tend my roses, and watch the village weave its next tale. There's always a puzzle if you know where to look. The conversation turned to lighter matters. Mrs. Bantry's plans for a winter garden party, the Colonel's latest fishing triumph, the new curate's unfortunate sermon. But Miss Marple's mind lingered on the case's deeper currents. Ruby, Keene, and Dinah Lee had been young, vibrant, caught in a web not of their making. Their deaths had exposed the fragility of ambition, the peril of wealth, and the quiet strength of truth. She thought of Conway, grieving but resolute, of Josie, adrift in her guilt, and of Adelaide, whose steadfastness had held firm against the storm. Each had left a mark, a stitch in the fabric of her understanding. A second visitor arrived at noon, announced by a soft knock. It was Adelaide Jefferson, her delicate features softened by a tentative smile, a small parcel in her hands. "Miss Marple," she said, stepping into the parlour, "I hope I'm not intruding. Conway sent me. He wanted you to have this, as a token of our gratitude." Miss Marple rose, her curiosity piqued, and accepted the parcel, unwrapping it to reveal a delicate silver brooch, shaped like a rose, its petals etched with fine detail. "How lovely," she said, her voice warm. "Please thank Mr. Jefferson for me. It's far too generous." Adelaide's smile deepened. "He insisted, Miss Marple. You gave him closure, and the trust, it's given him purpose. He's talking of visiting St. Mary Mead to see the village that shaped you." Miss Marple's eyes twinkled. "He'd be most welcome, Mrs. Jefferson. And you, how are you faring after all this?" Adelaide's expression grew pensive, her hands folding in her lap. "It's been hard, Miss Marple. Conway's grief, Mark's betrayal, it's shaken us. But my son, Peter, keeps me grounded. I'm learning to see the world through his eyes, to find hope again. Your clarity helped us through, and I'll always be grateful." Miss Marple nodded, sensing the strength beneath Adelaide's quiet words. "Hope is a resilient thing, Mrs. Jefferson. Ruby's trust will nurture it for many others. If you ever need a listener, my door is open." Adelaide thanked her and left, her steps lighter, and Miss Marple returned to her chair, pinning the brooch to her cardigan. Mrs. Bantry, who had watched the exchange with interest, clapped her hands. "Jane, you're collecting admirers. First Slack, now Conway, and Adelaide. You'll be the talk of Danemouth next." Miss Marple's cheeks pinked, but her tone was dry. "Admirers, Dolly? I'd rather have a quiet afternoon and a good cup of tea. But I'll treasure the brooch. It's a reminder that even in darkness, kindness blooms." The afternoon passed in tranquil companionship, with Mrs. Bantry staying for lunch. A simple affair of soup and bread, served by Miss Marple's maid Cherry. The talk turned to the future. The Colonel's plan to join a local history society, Mrs. Bantry's ambition to redecorate the library, and Miss Marple's quiet resolve to finish her scarf before winter. Yet, beneath the surface, Miss Marple's mind remained active, sifting through the case's echoes. She thought of the library, its polished shelves now free of tragedy, and the back door, its new lock a silent testament to vigilance. She thought of the pier, where Ruby and Dinah had met their fates, and the quarry, where Dinah's body had been hidden in a desperate bid to deceive. Each place was a marker, a point in the pattern that had led her to the truth. Mark Gaskell's calculated cruelty, Basil Blake's reckless complicity, Josie Turner's protective silence, These were human flaws, as old as the hills, yet always new in their unfolding. As Mrs. Bantry prepared to leave, she paused at the door, her eyes searching Miss Marple's face. "Jane, you're sure there's nothing more? That man from Ruby's past, the one Conway mentioned, he's not out there plotting something else, is he?" Miss Marple's smile was reassuring, though her mind lingered on the question. "The man is a shadow, Dolly, likely a figure from their foster days who shaped their choices, but not their deaths. Mark and Basil were the hands that struck, and they're in custody. The case is closed, and St. Mary Mead is safe, for now." Mrs. Bantry laughed, her spirits restored. "For now, indeed. With you here, Jane, I pity the next villain who tries. I'll see you at the memorial service. Don't forget, Sunday at 10. Miss Marple waved her off, returning to her parlour as the afternoon waned. She sat by the window, her knitting resumed, the needles a quiet echo of her thoughts. The blackbird returned to the garden, its song a fragile melody against the rustle of leaves. She thought of Ruby, with her dreams, of the stage and Dinah, with her desperate hope for a share of that dream. Their lives had been brief, their ends cruel, but their story had found its voice through her persistence. "Life is a puzzle," she murmured, her eyes on the garden's fading light, "but the pieces always fit in the end." She set her needles aside, reaching for her tea, its warmth a comfort against the autumn chill. The brooch gleamed on her cardigan, a rose born of sorrow, and she touched it lightly. A silent vow to watch, to listen, to unravel the next mystery that might stir the peace of St. Mary Mead. As the sun dipped below the horizon, Miss Marple's parlour grew dim, but her mind was alight with the quiet certainty that truth, like her garden's roses, would always find a way to bloom.